It was late October when my buddy and I decided to head up to the Poudre Canyon for one last camping trip before winter really set in. Most of the campgrounds were already closed for the season, but that didn't bother us. We both had years of experience camping all over Colorado and Utah. We knew how to find a decent spot off the road and make do with whatever the mountain gave us. Still, from the moment we pulled off onto that narrow dirt spur and stepped out of the truck, something about the place felt wrong. There wasn't any obvious reason for it. The air was still cold but not freezing. The canyon walls caught the late afternoon light in that golden, dusty way that usually made me feel at peace. But this time, I didn't. The silence had a weight to it, and I remember how my chest felt a little tight, as if the air wasn't moving right. We found a flat enough spot just off the tree line. Pines stood close together there, with dry needles covering the ground like a brown blanket. The ground was uneven, but we made it work. While clearing out the area for the tent, I noticed a shape near one of the trees, half hidden under leaves and debris. When I walked over, I saw it was a blanket, gray, sun-faded, wrapped tightly around something. It had that stiff look that comes from being out in the weather too long. I nudged it with my boot and the fabric slipped a little. Underneath was the skeleton of a small animal. Maybe a dog, maybe a raccoon. Hard to tell. The skull was mostly clean, but some of the ribs still had dark patches on them. The smell was faint, but there, sour and old. I remember staring at it longer than I should have, feeling unsettled by the idea that someone had wrapped it up like that instead of letting nature take its course. It felt deliberate, like a burial that didn't belong there. We both tried to shake it off and went for a hike to stretch our legs before dark. We climbed up one of the nearby hills, the kind that start gradual then turn into steep, rocky scrambles. The ground was soft and crumbly, filled with pine roots and loose rock. About halfway up, I noticed something bright hanging from a tree a little ways ahead. When we got closer, we realized it was an old tent, torn and tangled in branches, the nylon fabric fluttering slightly even though there wasn't much wind. It must have been there for months, maybe a year. It looked like someone had tried to pull it up into the tree on purpose. We both thought the same thing, that there could be a body in there. The way it was tied up just didn't make sense otherwise. When we got close enough to see inside, there wasn't a body, but there were things. A rolled-up sleeping bag, faded red and moldy, and a bunch of notebooks stacked together, damp but intact. I could see that some of the pages were filled with handwriting, the ink running where water had soaked in. The notebooks were shoved deep into the corners of the tent, like whoever left them wanted to hide them. I didn't touch them. I just remember the smell, a mix of mildew, dirt, and something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. The whole scene felt wrong. No one abandons a tent in a tree like that for no reason. We decided to start heading back down before it got dark. The light was fading fast, and that part of the canyon turned shadowy early. On the way down, we ended up sliding along a steep side of the hill, using small trees to steady ourselves. It was the kind of slope where one wrong step could send you tumbling 50 feet. As we moved through the trees, I caught a sudden, sharp smell that made my stomach twist. The unmistakable stench of decay. Fresh, strong, thick in the air. I looked around, expecting to see something obvious. A deer carcass, maybe. But the smell was coming from somewhere up ahead, off to the right. There, tucked against the base of a tree, was a towel. It was small and white once, but now gray and stained. It was folded strangely with something inside. It was sitting in such an odd spot, a steep slope, 200 or maybe 300 feet up from the road, not somewhere anyone would accidentally drop something. Whoever put it there had to climb up and place it intentionally. That thought stayed with me. The idea that someone had carried it all the way up there just to leave it at the base of that one tree. The smell told me what it probably was, but I didn't want to know. We left it and continued down to camp, both of us quiet for the rest of the way. That night, the air turned colder, and we built a fire that burned hotter than usual. The bourbon helped a little, though not much. Every time I looked out into the dark beyond the firelight, I imagined shapes between the trees. The blanket with the dead animal, the tent hanging from branches, the towel on the hill. It all swirled together in my head. like pieces of something I wasn't meant to see. I tried to ignore it, but the thought of the towel stayed with me the most. I couldn't stop wondering what exactly was inside it and why someone would put it there. After enough bourbon, we decided to go back up the hill and check. It felt like the kind of thing that would haunt us if we didn't. The climb was harder in the dark. The flashlight beams bounced around, cutting through the trees and catching every little thing. Bits of bark, spider webs, the shine of wet leaves. My heart was pounding by the time we reached the spot. The towel was still there, the smell stronger now, like the air itself was rotting. I used a stick to nudge one corner open. Inside was an owl. A big one, gray and white, feathers still glossy and clean except for where the head met the body. It hadn't been dead long, maybe a day, maybe two. Whoever did it had wrapped it carefully, almost tenderly. That was the part that stuck with me, the carefulness of it. Like whoever did this wasn't trying to hide it, but preserve it, honor it in some strange way. The smell hit us full then. That warm, wet, unmistakable smell of something recently dead. I stepped back fast, nearly slipping on the loose dirt. We didn't talk much after that. We went back to the fire, drank more, and tried to pretend the world outside our little circle of light didn't exist. But every sound, a snapping twig, the rush of wind, the occasional rustle, felt amplified. I barely slept that night. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps or breathing near the tent. It was probably just the trees creaking in the cold, but my brain didn't care. When morning came, the sun was pale and the ground was stiff with frost. I felt a strange sense of urgency, like I needed to get out before the day fully started. We packed fast, barely ate. As I loaded the truck, I kept glancing back toward the hill, toward where that owl had been. I remember thinking that someone, somewhere, probably still came up there. Maybe they still wrapped things in towels and left them in trees. Maybe that spot wasn't random to them at all. We drove out of the canyon in silence, the road winding along the river, sunlight flashing through the trees. The deeper we got into town, the lighter I felt, like shaking off a heavy layer of something invisible. Still, even now when I think about that place, it feels like unfinished business. There was no explanation for what we saw, no reason anyone would do that, and that's what makes it worse. It wasn't supernatural, but it didn't need to be. Some things people do out there in the quiet, hidden corners of the world are scarier than anything else. And the thought that someone was up on that hill, wrapping a freshly killed owl in a towel and tucking it into a tree, that's what stayed with me ever since. I was traveling alone around the Olympic Peninsula, just taking a break from everything. No plans, no deadlines, just me and my car. I had been driving for hours through the winding forest roads of Olympic National Park, stopping whenever something caught my eye. That day was unusually hot for fall, the air heavy and still, and by the time I reached Quinault, I was sweating through my shirt. I didn't even plan to stop there, but a narrow road leading down through the trees toward the Quinault River looked too peaceful to ignore. It ended at a quiet clearing beside the water, a place that felt completely untouched. There was an old wooden footbridge that stretched across the river, barely holding together, its boards gray and warped with age. It looked like something built 100 years ago and forgotten about. The river moved slow and clear beneath it, cold-looking but inviting. There was no one else around. Not a single car, no voices, just that deep silence you only get in thick forests where sound doesn't travel far. It was off-season, and I could tell this wasn't a tourist stop. No signs, no picnic benches, just the road, the trees, and the water. It felt like I'd stumbled into a piece of the park no one used anymore. I sat there for a few minutes with my window rolled down, listening to the water and the faint rustling of branches. The air was hot, uncomfortably so, and after a while I couldn't stand it. I needed to cool off. I backed my car as close to the river's edge as I could, making sure it faced the way out in case I needed to leave fast. Then I grabbed a towel and started working my way down the embankment. There was no real path, just layers of brush, blackberry vines, ferns, and fallen branches. It was harder than I expected, my shoes slipping on the dirt and roots, my arms getting scratched. The air felt thicker the closer I got to the water, and I could smell the wet rocks and the faint metallic scent of the river. When I finally stepped onto the gravel at the bottom, I felt completely cut off from everything else. My car was up there somewhere, hidden by the brush. The river was beautiful, wide and shallow near the edge, deeper and darker in the middle. I didn't have a swimsuit. This wasn't planned, so I stripped down to my underwear and bra and stepped in. The water was freezing, sharp against my skin, but it felt incredible after the heat. I waded out until it reached my waist and then dropped under, feeling the current pull gently past my arms and legs. The cold numbed everything. For a few minutes I just floated there, breathing slow, watching the sunlight flicker on the surface. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But after a while, I started to get that feeling, like I wasn't alone. At first it was faint, just that uneasy weight that sits at the back of your neck. I told myself it was nothing, probably just nerves from being out here alone, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The forest was silent in that strange, heavy way it gets when something alive is nearby. No birds, no insects, just still air and the sound of water. I turned toward the far side of the river. It was steep there, thick with brush and moss, a wall of green shadows. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake it. My stomach started to tighten. I decided to get out. The second I stepped onto the rocks and started walking toward my pile of clothes, I felt it again, stronger this time, like eyes were following me. I looked up across the river and froze. There was a man standing there, just a few yards away on the opposite embankment. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, barefoot, and covered in layers of animal pelts that looked stitched together into a rough poncho. His hair was long and tangled, full of sticks hanging over part of his face. His skin was filthy, his arms dark with sun and dirt. He looked like he had been living out there for a long time. His posture was strange, still but tense, like he was waiting for something. We just stared at each other across the river, me half naked and dripping, him standing perfectly still. For what felt like a full minute, neither of us moved. The only sound was the river between us. My body went rigid, my breath shallow. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. Then suddenly he turned and ran. He didn't run away from me. He ran toward the direction of the old bridge. That was the moment everything inside me flipped into panic. I knew instantly what he was doing. The bridge connected his side to mine, and if he was heading that way, he'd reach me in less than a minute. I didn't think. I just grabbed my car key, which I'd left near my clothes, and tried to pull my things on, but they were caught in the blackberry vines. I yanked at them until the fabric tore, but it was too slow. I dropped everything and started running barefoot through the brush, trying to climb back up the same embankment I came down. The blackberries ripped my legs and arms open as I pushed through, the thorns catching on my skin. The ground was uneven, and I slipped more than once, my hands sinking into mud and rotting leaves. I could hear my own breathing getting louder, harsher, and somewhere behind it, faintly at first, I heard the sound of wood creaking, then a thud. It was the bridge. He was crossing. I didn't stop. My only thought was to get to the car before he did. When I finally broke through the brush, I could see my car at the top of the clearing, sunlight reflecting off the windshield. My legs were bleeding, my feet sliced open from rocks and thorns, but I ran harder than I ever have in my life. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut just as I saw him appear from the trees. He was coming fast, stumbling but focused, his eyes locked on me. He hit the hood a second later, slamming his fists down and screaming, this deep, wordless sound that didn't even seem human. His face was twisted with rage, veins bulging in his neck, his teeth bared. The car shook under his weight as he pounded on the metal, and I could see his hands smeared with dirt and old blood. When he moved toward my door handle, I slammed the car into gear and hit the gas. Gravel flew up from the tires as I tore down that narrow road, the engine whining, my hand slipping on the steering wheel. I looked into the rearview mirror and saw him running after me. He kept up for longer than I thought possible, his arms pumping, his bare feet pounding the road, his mouth open like he was still screaming. Eventually he fell behind, shrinking until he disappeared between the trees. I drove for miles before I finally stopped. My whole body was shaking. Blood was running down my legs from dozens of small cuts. I realized I had left everything: my clothes, my towel, my shoes, even my phone. The inside of the car smelled like river water and fear. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to stop shaking, trying to convince myself that it was over. But even now, years later, I can still see his face when I close my eyes. That wild look, that pure intent. I never went back to Kino. I never even drove near that part of the park again. Since that day, I've never gone hiking or swimming alone, not once. I learned what it feels like to be hunted, not in a story, not in a dream, but in real life. And that kind of fear stays with you forever. I was camping deep in the Amazon rainforest, a few hours from Manaus, in an area that was only accessible by boat and a long walk through thick jungle. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was definitely the most isolated place I had ever been. The forest around us felt alive in every direction. Every second there were sounds, clicks, hums, screeches, wings, splashes, and sometimes a deep silence that made me even more uneasy. During the day, the light filtered through the leaves in long, thin beams, and the air was thick and damp. Everything smelled like wet soil and plant decay, a smell that clung to my skin no matter how many times I washed in the river. We had set up our tents near a slow-moving stream that glimmered in the moonlight at night. The trees around our camp were massive, their roots twisting above the ground like giant veins. The first night went fine, though the noises kept me awake for hours. There were frogs the size of my hand croaking near the water, insects that buzzed like tiny motors, and once in a while, a branch snapping somewhere in the dark that made my heart skip. But by the second night I had gotten used to it. I fell asleep quickly after a long day of hiking and swimming, my body sore but relaxed inside the tent. At some point deep into the night I woke up with an uncomfortable pressure in my bladder. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling got worse until it was painful. The air inside the tent was warm and smelled faintly of sweat and damp clothes. I reached for my flashlight, but the battery had died earlier that evening, so I had to rely on the faint blue-white light of the moon filtering through the mesh of the tent. The others were still asleep, their slow breathing blending with the distant noise of the forest. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I quietly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was soft under my bare feet, still warm from the day. The moon was bright enough to see faint outlines of the trees and the shimmer of the river through the gaps in the branches. I didn't want to go too far, but I knew the sound of me peeing close to the tents might wake someone, so I walked a little deeper into the trees, maybe 20 or 30 feet away from camp. Every step made soft squishing noises in the wet soil. I could hear something moving high in the trees, a monkey maybe, or some bird stirring in its nest, but it was hard to tell what was what out there. I stopped beside a thick tree trunk that looked like it had been split by lightning at some point, crouched down a bit and lowered my pants. I was careful not to touch the ground. The whole time I was painfully aware of how exposed I was. My skin prickled from the cool air and from how quiet it suddenly seemed. The usual humming and croaking had faded, and for a second, the forest felt completely still. I could hear my own breathing and the faint trickle of my pee hitting the dirt. That's when I heard it. A sound of something stepping through the brush behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, and not small ones either. The kind that pressed leaves and twigs flat into the ground. I froze instantly. The hairs on my arms stood straight up, and I stopped breathing for a second. It wasn't the sound of a frog or bird or even a small animal. It was heavier, slower. I could hear its shifting weight, the soft crunch of damp leaves, the sound of something brushing against branches. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet behind me, just out of sight in the dark. For a moment I didn't even dare to move. My body was shaking so hard I almost fell forward. My first thought was that it might be a jaguar. I had read that they were silent hunters, but maybe this one wasn't stalking. It was just moving around, maybe curious. I knew if I turned or made a noise, I could trigger something I couldn't escape from. I kept staring at the ground, too afraid to even pull up my pants, heart beating so fast it felt like I could hear it in my ears. The sound came again, this time closer. Another step, then another. It was definitely walking upright now, or at least I thought it was. It was too heavy and too steady to be something crawling or slithering. I tried to convince myself it could be one of the others from camp, but I knew everyone was asleep, and the sound didn't feel human. It felt like something that belonged out there, something used to moving in the dark. I quickly finished and pulled my pants back up, my fingers trembling so bad that I almost fumbled the waistband. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was so strong it made me feel sick to my stomach. My whole body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly at first, just walking quietly toward the direction of the tents. I could feel the ground sticking to my bare feet, mud squeezing between my toes. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but that didn't make me feel safer. It just made it worse because I couldn't tell if whatever it was had stopped or if it was following me silently. When I reached the tents, I practically dove inside mine and zipped it up in one shaky motion. I sat there in the dark, trying to listen. The noises of the forest started to come back little by little, the frogs, the insects, the faint rustle of leaves, but I couldn't shake the sound I had heard. I lay down and pulled my sleeping bag up to my chest, trying to calm my breathing, but I didn't sleep again that night. Every little sound made my heart race. When the first light of morning came through the fabric of the tent, I finally sat up. The air was cool and misty, and I could hear the birds starting to call from the trees. I stepped outside and looked around the area where I had gone the night before. The ground was soft and damp, and there were footprints, mine, small and bare, and next to them a few larger impressions that weren't from any of my friends. They weren't boot prints. They looked more like wide, heavy animal tracks, but I couldn't identify what kind. Too big for a monkey, too narrow for a tapir. Whatever it was, it had been standing close. Way too close. I didn't tell anyone about it. It sounded stupid, like I was overreacting to some animal wandering by. But the image of those prints stuck with me all day. I kept looking at the edge of the trees, half expecting to see something watching from the shadows. That night, I didn't leave the tent, no matter how bad I needed to pee. I stayed still and listened to the forest breathing around me, that endless mix of life and movement. Later, when I got back to Manaus, I showed a guide a photo I took of the tracks. He said they looked like they might have been from a big tapir, but he also said tapirs don't usually come close to camps like that. He told me not to worry, that the forest is full of things that move at night that people never see. I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't just some random animal passing through. The way it had walked, the timing, how it stopped right behind me, it felt like it had been aware of me, watching me. Even now, when I think about that night, I can still feel the cold air on my skin and the weight of something unseen standing just behind me. I'll never know what it was, but sometimes I wake up from dreams where I'm back there, half squatting in the dark with the moonlight on my back, frozen, waiting to hear that slow step in the leaves again. And every time I feel the same thing I did that night in the Amazon, the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. When I think about the worst things I've ever seen in my life, there are two moments that always come back to me in full detail, like they were carved into the back of my skull. Both happened years apart, and I still can't decide which one changed me more. The first time I was 8 or 9. The second time I was in college. But they both happened in quiet, empty places where I thought I was safe, surrounded by trees and water and nothing else. I guess that's what makes them stick with me. The fact that I wasn't supposed to find anything like that out there. When I was a kid, my mom used to make baskets and other things out of vines, reeds, and dried grasses. She liked to go to this reservoir that I think was somewhere near a national park. It had these little coves where the water was still, and the banks were covered with tall grass and driftwood and old cans that people tossed out of their boats. She would walk along the edge of the water and gather materials while I'd wander around with a plastic bag, picking up trash. She gave me a nickel for every piece I found, so I took it seriously. I'd fill the bag with bottle caps, candy wrappers, old bait containers, whatever was left behind. I didn't really pay attention to where I was going most of the time. I just kept my head down, scanning the ground, trying to earn enough to get a soda on the way home. That day was bright but cold. The water was still, except for the occasional ripple from the wind. I remember hearing my mom's voice somewhere behind me, humming like she always did when she worked. I had a small basket with me too, the one she gave me to collect pretty stones or pine cones. I had both my bag and the basket, switching between them as I found things. I must have wandered farther than I meant to, because when I looked up, the area around me was quieter. The reeds were taller, and I couldn't see my mom anymore. I noticed something pale near the edge of the water. It was lying half in the mud and half in the shallows. It looked like a glove at first, the kind of thick garden glove my mom wore sometimes when she gathered reeds. The fingers were curled slightly, coated in a thin film of mud. I walked closer, and I remember how the ground got soft under my shoes, that sinking feeling where your feet make a sucking sound every time you lift them. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it would be an easy nickel. I don't think I even realized what I was looking at until I touched it. The moment I lifted it, I knew it wasn't a glove. It was heavy in a way that no glove should be. The skin was pale and waterlogged, the fingernails a faint blue color. I could see the end of the arm. It wasn't clean like in a movie, more like torn and ragged, dark around the edges. It didn't even look real at first, but it felt real. I remember the coldness of it, like it had been sitting at the bottom of the water for days. My hands froze around it. I wanted to drop it, but my fingers wouldn't let go. My brain went blank, and all I could do was scream. When I screamed, it didn't even sound like me. It was loud but far away, like someone else was doing it. My body felt locked. My mom came running from somewhere behind me, but I couldn't move or speak. I just kept screaming, my hand still clenched around that thing. She had to pull it out of my hand herself. I remember seeing her face go pale as she did. Then we were back at the car and then at a gas station, and the rest was a blur. It was the 90s, before anyone had a cell phone, so we had to find a payphone. I remember the smell of gasoline and my mom's shaking hands as she tried to explain to the clerk what happened. The police came later. They asked questions, but I didn't want to talk. Someone later told me that a group of teenagers had been drinking on a boat and one fell in, hit by the propeller. I had found what was left of him. My mom told me it was just an animal's paw at first, to calm me down, but I already knew what I'd seen. I didn't talk for weeks after that. I still have trouble looking at dead animals, even now. There's something about that color, that lifeless weight, that makes my stomach twist. Years later, when I was in college, I thought I'd gotten past it. I took up hiking to clear my head between classes. I liked being out in the woods alone. No noise, no people, just the sound of my boots on dirt and wind moving through branches. One spring, after a really stressful semester, I planned a solo trip to an area in southwestern Colorado. I wanted to camp for a few days, just me and the trees, away from everything. I packed light and drove out early in the morning, parked near a small trailhead and started walking before sunrise. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and it felt good to be out there. For most of the day it was peaceful. I saw deer tracks, heard woodpeckers tapping at trunks, and found a spot near a stream where I planned to spend the night. Around the afternoon, as I started to head back toward the main trail, I heard voices somewhere behind me. A group of people, laughing, shouting, too loud for that quiet place. I didn't feel like dealing with anyone, so I stepped off the trail and started moving through the trees to give them space. It was thick woods, branches tangled overhead, and the ground uneven with fallen logs. I figured I'd loop around and rejoin the trail farther down, but the deeper I went, the more it felt wrong. The air was still, and I couldn't hear the group anymore. Everything was too quiet. Then I saw something pale through the trees again. Bones. At first I thought they were animal remains. As I got closer, I saw there were hundreds of them. They were arranged in patterns, some hung from branches by bits of string or wire, some stacked into piles. In the middle of the clearing was a structure, almost like a table made entirely of bones. Deer legs, rib cages, skulls, even smaller ones that looked like birds or maybe rabbits. Pieces of metal dangled from branches like wind chimes, clinking softly whenever the breeze moved through. There were burn marks on the ground, and old wax melted into the dirt. It looked like someone had been there often, someone who spent time building that place. I stood there for a long time, just staring. I don't think I even breathed. The whole scene felt like something I wasn't supposed to see. There were no bodies, no blood, but everything about it felt wrong, too careful, too deliberate. It wasn't the work of animals or random chance. Someone had made it, and they had done it for a reason. I didn't want to think about what that reason might be. When I finally turned around, I noticed how quiet everything was again. Even the wind seemed to stop. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't even care if I got lost at that point. I just wanted to get away. I walked fast, almost running, trying to retrace my steps until I saw the trail again. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I didn't camp that night. I drove straight back to town and slept in a cheap motel with the TV on, just so I wouldn't have to be alone in the dark. That was the last time I went camping. It's strange how both times it was just me wandering somewhere quiet, doing something simple, picking up trash, walking in the woods, and both times I found something that wasn't meant to be found. The hand by the lake, the altar in the forest, they're tied together in my head somehow. Both of them made me realize that nature hides things. The trees, the water, the quiet. They make you feel safe, but they cover everything that's rotting underneath. I still go hiking sometimes, but only on crowded trails, and I never step off the path anymore. I've learned that once you've seen what people can leave behind in the wild, you can't ever unsee it. I still think about that morning sometimes. It was one of those days that started out so normal, but by the time it ended, I realized how close we had come to something really bad. My friend and I had been camping in the same remote spot for years, a small clearing near a pond on the edge of a national forest in Northern California. We had found it by accident during one of our longer hikes and made it our secret place. Nobody ever came out there. There were no trails, no fire rings, no trash, no signs that anyone else even knew about it. To get there, you had to drive a rough dirt road for miles, then hike another 1.5 miles through brush and uneven terrain. That isolation was what made it special for us. It always felt like our own private slice of wilderness. It was early in the morning when we pulled up that day. The air was still cold and heavy with dew, and the sun was just beginning to push light through the fog hanging in the trees. The sound of the truck engine cut through the stillness, but otherwise everything was quiet. We parked in the same small dirt turnout we always used, the one just before the game trail that led down to the pond. I remember turning off the ignition and sitting for a second, just listening to the forest. You could always hear the faint trickle of water somewhere down below and birds moving through the branches. But that morning, before I even opened my door, I saw movement ahead of us on the road. At first I thought it was a pair of deer. Two big shapes moving slowly side by side. Then I realized it wasn't deer. It was 2 mountain lions. I'd only ever seen one before, and that was years back. Seeing 2 of them right in front of us was something else entirely. They were about 50 feet away, right in the middle of the road, and they weren't just passing through. They were mating. For a moment, I didn't even believe what I was seeing. My friend and I both froze in the truck, watching through the windshield. It felt like we were intruding on something we shouldn't be seeing. The whole thing was surreal. The male was huge, his coat thick and smooth, and the female looked smaller but just as muscular. We stayed quiet inside the truck with the windows rolled up, barely breathing. The forest was so still you could almost hear the insects. After a few minutes, they finished and just lingered in the same area. They weren't in a rush to go anywhere. The male paced a little, marking a tree, then circled around the female. It was wild to watch. We sat there, our trip completely forgotten for the moment. Eventually, they both stopped moving and turned their heads sharply toward the trees on the right side of the road. Their ears went up and they froze like statues. It was like they both sensed something at the exact same time. I couldn't hear anything from inside the truck, but I could see the change in their body language. They went from relaxed to on edge in a second. The male's tail twitched, and the female lowered herself close to the ground. Then, almost at the same time, they both bolted. Not toward the trees, but away from them, disappearing down the road behind us. They didn't just walk away. They sprinted, tails low, as if something had scared the hell out of them. That alone was strange enough to make my stomach tighten. Mountain lions aren't easy to scare. If something could spook 2 full-grown lions, it had to be big. A few seconds later, we found out what it was. From the same direction the lions had been staring, a deer burst out of the tree line. Then another. Then a third. They were running full speed, leaping across the road like their lives depended on it. And right behind them came a massive black bear. I had never seen one that large. Its head looked almost as big as a car tire, and it was running faster than I thought a bear could move. Its front paws tore at the dirt as it came out of the woods, focused completely on the deer ahead of it. The entire moment lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt longer. The bear didn't even look toward the truck. It was locked on its chase. The deer scattered through the brush across the road, and the bear crashed after them, snapping branches and sending dust into the air. Then everything went silent again, except for the distant cracking of trees as the animals moved deeper into the woods. We just sat there. Neither of us said a word. I remember the smell of the dirt, the faint vibration of the truck still settling after I had hit the brake pedal too hard. My heart was pounding and I could feel sweat on my hands even though the air was cold. I don't think I had ever seen that much raw power in front of me. Seeing those lions, and then the bear right after, it made me realize just how small we were out there. We waited for maybe 10 minutes before even thinking about moving again. The forest went back to being quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier, like everything had just witnessed something violent and was waiting to see what came next. I scanned the trees, half expecting the bear to circle back or the lions to reappear, but nothing else moved. Eventually, we decided not to go through with the camping trip. It didn't feel right anymore. The idea of hiking in there, knowing that a bear that size and 2 lions were active in the same area, made the thought of pitching a tent feel stupid. I turned the key and started the truck, and we backed out slow, checking every shadow between the trees as we went. The drive out was long. The road wound through miles of forest, and every time I saw movement, branches swaying, birds taking off, it made me tense. The whole time I kept thinking about how those lions had known something was coming before we did. They had felt it before there was even a sound. It made me realize how much more aware animals are of the world around them than we are. If they hadn't been there, we might have stepped out of the truck to unload gear and started walking down the trail, completely unaware that a bear was in full chase nearby. When we finally hit the paved road, I pulled over for a minute just to let my hands stop shaking. I remember looking back through the trees one last time. Everything looked peaceful again. Sunlight hitting the tops of the pines, mist rising off the ground. You'd never guess what had happened just a few miles back. That was the last time we went camping there. It wasn't because of fear exactly, but more out of respect. That patch of forest belonged to the animals, and that morning made it clear we didn't. We had been lucky to see what we saw from inside the safety of a truck. If we had arrived 5 minutes earlier, stepped out onto that dirt road, and started walking with our packs, we might have been right in the middle of a bear's hunt. Every time I think back on it, I realize how close we came without even knowing. Nature doesn't give warnings. You just happen to see them if you're paying attention. That morning we were lucky the mountain lion saw it first. It was my first time ever camping, and I hated every second of it. I was in 7th grade, and the whole trip had sounded fun when the teachers first mentioned it. Some big adventure in the woods with my classmates, a few nights away from school, hiking, campfires, the usual brochure-type excitement. But once we actually got there, all I could think about was how far from home we were. It was about 5 hours away, in some park surrounded by tall pine trees and dirt roads that all looked the same. The air was damp and cold, and everything smelled like wet wood and smoke. The cabin we were assigned to felt like an old storage shed with bunk beds. The wood was rough and splintered, and the mattress was more like a sack filled with stale air. I remember lying there the first night, every sound outside feeling too loud, the crickets too close, the floor creaking with every movement from someone shifting in bed. I wanted to be home so badly I could feel it in my chest. When everyone else finally fell asleep, the whole cabin went quiet except for the sound of someone snoring and the occasional creak from the beams in the ceiling. I stared at the darkness for hours, tossing around, trying to get comfortable, but every position felt wrong. The blanket was thin, the pillow was lumpy, and the wood underneath me felt like it was pressing into my spine. The smell inside was a mix of damp socks, bug spray, and sweat. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't care if I got in trouble. I needed air. I slid out from under the blanket as quietly as I could and stepped toward the door. The cabin door was old and heavy, and it made a soft scraping sound when I opened it. The night air hit me immediately. It was cold, but it felt fresh, and I could finally breathe. Outside was dark in a way I'd never experienced before. There weren't any street lights, no headlights, just the small glow of the stars and the moonlight cutting through the tops of the trees. Everything was still except for the faint rustling from the forest. I sat down on the small step just outside the cabin door and pulled out my little book light and my library book. I had been obsessed with Christopher Pike at that age, and I'd brought one of his books with me, thinking it would make the nights less boring. The little light barely reached the pages, but I didn't care. It gave me something to focus on other than the dark woods around me. The night felt heavy. It wasn't noisy, but it wasn't silent either. There was always some faint sound, something moving in the distance, the crunch of leaves, a twig snapping somewhere far off. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or maybe some raccoon, but the feeling didn't go away. Every so often, I would glance up from the page and look around. I couldn't see much, just shadows and shapes blending into each other. But I had that feeling, like someone was looking right at me. It wasn't even a sound or a movement. It was just that deep, uncomfortable instinct that creeps up your spine, the kind that makes your skin prickle before you even realize why. I tried to ignore it. I focused on the words in front of me, tracing them with my finger, trying to lose myself in the story. But every few seconds I found myself glancing up again. The dark tree line felt like a wall pressing closer. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself it was just nerves, that it was stupid to be scared at a campsite surrounded by teachers and other kids. It wasn't like anything bad could happen out there. It was camp. They had safety rules and fences and everything. I don't know what made me move my book that way, but at one point I shifted it slightly to turn a page, and the beam of my book light caught something, two glowing points in the dark. My brain didn't register what they were at first, just two tiny reflections staring straight at me. It looked unreal for a second, like eyes painted on glass. My stomach dropped instantly. The light trembled in my hand as I tilted it again. And that's when I saw the outline, just a faint shape at first. Low to the ground, still silent. It took my brain a moment to make sense of it, but then I saw the glint of fur, the shape of a head, and the unmistakable curve of a large paw resting on the dirt. It was a mountain lion, a real one. I'd seen pictures of them before, but seeing one that close was something else entirely. Its body was partly hidden in the dark, but its eyes reflected back that eerie, yellow-white light. I felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't 10 feet away, maybe just down the steps a few yards back. But when you're a kid sitting alone in the dark, that distance feels like nothing. The book slipped out of my hands, and the light fell to the side, its beam landing uselessly on the dirt. My eyes adjusted just enough to catch the faint outline of the cat's body. It was big, bigger than I ever imagined. I could see the muscles under its fur, the slow, careful movement of its chest as it breathed. Its tail flicked once, barely visible, but that tiny movement felt like a warning. I didn't move. My whole body felt frozen, like my brain couldn't send the signal to do anything. I didn't even blink. All I could think about was that if I made a sound, if I moved an inch, that thing could jump before I even knew it. Time stopped making sense. I don't know if it was 5 seconds or 30. My mind was running wild, trying to come up with something to do. I thought about the other kids sleeping inside, how nobody had any idea what was happening just a few feet away. I thought about my dad, about how angry he would be if I got hurt doing something I wasn't supposed to. I thought about the teachers finding blood on the steps in the morning. I didn't even know if you were supposed to run or stay still or make noise. I just sat there, my back pressed against the door, my hand shaking as I tried to find the handle behind me. It took forever, or at least it felt that way. But finally my fingers touched cold metal. I gripped it, trying not to make a sound. I twisted slowly, praying the latch wouldn't squeak, and then I just pulled myself backward. I don't even remember how I moved. I just remember falling back inside the cabin and slamming the door shut with my heel. I laid there on the floor, staring at the wood, waiting for the sound of claws or scratching or something. But nothing happened. The silence came back, and I could only hear my heartbeat and the slow breathing of everyone else asleep inside. I crawled back to my cot, still shaking. I pulled the thin blanket over me and just stared at the ceiling, wide awake until the first bit of light came through the window. When morning came, everything looked normal. The camp smelled like pancakes and campfire smoke again. I went outside with the others, pretending like I'd slept fine. My library book was lying in the dirt by the step, the corner bent and damp from the night air. The teacher scolded me for leaving it out there, and I just nodded, pretending to be sorry. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't even want to say the words out loud because somehow it felt like it would make it real again. Later that day, one of the counselors mentioned seeing big cat tracks by the edge of the woods. He said it casually, like it wasn't a big deal, like it happened sometimes. Everyone laughed about it, but I knew exactly where that mountain lion had been. Right there, at the bottom of those steps, staring at me while I sat alone with my book. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at the dirt, still seeing those eyes every time I blinked. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed on my cot, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours until we could leave. I'd never felt so grateful to see a school bus in my life. When we finally drove away from that camp, I didn't look back once. I was working with a grad student out in the Jornada del Muerto one summer during college, helping collect soil and vegetation data for a long-term desert ecosystem study. The Jornada is one of those places that barely feels real when you first see it. Just a huge, flat stretch of dry land under an endless sky. The dirt roads ran for miles without a single bend, and the air always shimmered from the heat. We stayed in a small field camp made up of 2 tents, a metal trailer that held our gear, and an old water tank that leaked a little near the base. Every morning we'd drive out before sunrise, when the sky was still a dull pink and the desert was cool enough to breathe in without it hurting your throat. The grad student Mark was older than me by a few years, quiet and methodical. Most of the time I just followed his lead, taking notes, collecting samples, marking coordinates, that sort of thing. That day started like any other. It was early July, and the air was thick with that static heat that comes before monsoon storms. The morning sun came up like a hot blade, and by 10 the ground was already radiating waves. You could see small dust devils spinning across the flats, rising up and fading out just as fast. There were bison off in the distance, scattered like dark rocks among the creosote, and prairie dogs darting in and out of their burrows. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the buzz of cicadas and the crunch of our boots on the gravel. We'd been working in one of the outer plots, about 20 miles from the main camp, logging data from soil traps. Around noon the wind started to pick up. You could feel it first as a low breath across the back of your neck. Then it turned into sharp gusts that lifted the dust into the air. The sky, which had been a washed-out blue all morning, began to darken in the distance. I remember thinking it looked like someone had smeared a line of ink across the horizon. The storms in the Jornada move fast, and when they hit, the roads become rivers of mud that can trap a truck for days. We packed up quickly, tossing equipment into the back of the pickup, the wind already stinging our faces with sand. The thunder started low, rolling in from miles away, and then the first drops began to fall. By the time we hit the dirt road heading back to camp, the rain was coming down in sheets so thick that the world outside the windshield disappeared every few seconds. The wipers worked hard but couldn't keep up. I could feel the tires slipping on the wet clay, and the truck fishtailed every now and then. The air smelled like wet dust and ozone. The rain hit the metal roof so hard it was like sitting inside a drum. About 5 or 6 miles from camp, we came around a slight bend, and that's when I saw it. Off to the right side of the road, maybe 15 feet away, there was a huge yucca bush completely on fire. Not smoking, not smoldering, burning with bright, violent orange flames. The fire was so intense it lit up the rain around it, making every drop look like tiny sparks falling through the air. The strangest thing was how clean it looked, like the fire had formed out of nowhere. There was no lightning flash in that moment, no smoldering wood or smoke trailing off into the air. The rest of the desert around it was drenched, the sand turning into mud, the plants weighed down with water. But that one bush was burning like it was soaked in gasoline. For a few seconds I just stared at it, trying to make sense of it. It didn't move or flicker the way most flames do in wind. It held steady, roaring upward, the rain hissing as it hit the base but doing nothing to slow it down. The heat even reached us through the open window, a wave of dry warmth that cut through the cold rain. It felt deeply wrong, something that didn't fit into the ordinary world. I guessed lightning must have hit it just before we came by, but even that didn't make full sense. Lightning strikes all the time out there, and usually the fire goes out fast in a downpour like that. I had never seen anything like it. We didn't stop. The road was getting worse by the minute, turning into soft mud that pulled at the tires, and the storm was coming down harder. The bush disappeared in the rearview mirror after a few seconds, swallowed up by the curtain of rain. But the image of it burned into my mind. The brightness of it against that gray desert, how impossible it looked. By the time we reached camp, the roads were nearly washed out. We parked near the trailer, both of us soaked, and spent the rest of the afternoon waiting out the storm inside. The rain came down for hours, the thunder rolling constantly in the distance. The air smelled like wet clay and ozone, sharp and electric. I couldn't shake the thought of that burning yucca. I tried to tell myself it was just a freak thing, a perfect strike of lightning hitting a resin pocket or something that made it flare like that. But there was something about it that didn't add up. The flames were too strong, too bright, and it had burned like it was untouched by the rain itself. When the storm finally broke late that evening, I walked out to look around. The desert had changed completely. What had been dry and cracked the day before was now a mirror of shallow water reflecting the orange of the setting sun. Everything was silent except for the dripping from the tents and the faint croak of toads that had come out after the rain. The air was cooler, heavy with the smell of wet sage. I thought about driving back to see if the bush was still burning, but the roads were impassable, thick with mud that could swallow a tire whole. I stayed by the camp instead, staring out at the distant mesas fading into the mist. The next morning, after the ground had dried enough, I decided to go back to that spot. The air was clean and bright, and the desert looked completely different under the washed-out light. I found the stretch of road easily. It was marked by a small cluster of rocks and a faded signpost we had passed dozens of times. I parked and walked out to where the yucca had been. There was nothing left, not even ash. The ground was scorched black in a wide circle, but the bush itself was gone, burned down to bare earth. The soil looked almost melted, hardened into a smooth crust like glass. I crouched and touched it. It was cool, but the texture was strange, brittle and fused, like something had burned hotter than natural fire. I stood there for a long time, the heat from the morning sun already rising off the sand. The only sound was the distant chirping of insects. There was no sign of anything else, no footprints, no tire marks other than my own. Nothing to explain it. I tried to reason it out. Maybe the lightning had hit something underground, some vein of old dry roots or trapped gas that made it burn hotter. But even that seemed weak. We stayed out there for 2 more weeks before the season ended. Every time I drove that stretch of road, I looked toward that same patch of ground. It stayed blackened the whole time, even after a few more storms passed through. Nothing grew back, not a blade of grass, just that burned patch in the middle of the desert, where the rain couldn't put out a single fire. Years later, I went back through old maps and field notes, and that spot was still there, marked faintly in satellite images as a dark scar. No one had written anything about it in the records, no mention of lightning or fire damage. It was just another small piece of land in the Jornada del Muerto, unchanged for decades. But I still think about it sometimes, the way it burned in the middle of that storm, untouched by the rain, so fierce it made the world around it seem unreal. It wasn't something supernatural or mystical, just a moment that didn't fit with how things should work. And for some reason, that made it even more unsettling. Because out there, in all that empty space, sometimes nature doesn't have to make sense to feel like a warning. It was early morning in western Wisconsin. The kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air and your fingers sting if you don't keep them moving. The sky was still dark blue when my dad and I left the hunting shack, riding the ATV up one of the steep wooded hills on my cousin's land. The headlights cut through the mist that hung low over the ground, and the sound of the engine echoed off the trees. I could smell the damp earth and pine, and every few seconds a cold gust of wind came through the woods, shaking water droplets loose from the branches. We were heading to our designated spot before the sun came up so we could be settled in for sunrise. The schedule in the shack made sure no one hunted the same hill at the same time, so I knew it was just me and my dad out there. We parked the ATV near a small clearing halfway up the ridge and climbed the rest of the way on foot. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under our boots, and every sound felt too loud in the stillness. My dad stopped once in a while to scan the woods, and I did the same, though there wasn't much to see. Just tall bare trees, patches of ferns, and fallen logs. We reached our spot near a line of thick oaks that overlooked a narrow valley. The sun hadn't risen yet, and everything had that dim bluish glow that comes right before dawn. I remember sitting down against a tree and feeling the cold soak through the fabric of my hunting gear. I tried to focus on the tree line, looking for any movement, but there was nothing. No birds, no rustling, not even a squirrel. By the time the sun started to rise, the woods were still dead quiet. Usually by that time you'd hear something, birds calling, a branch cracking, maybe the distant sound of another ATV. But that morning was unusually still. Hours went by and we didn't see a single deer. The air got colder instead of warmer, and I could see the faint steam of my own breath drifting away. Around 9, my dad signaled that it was time to head back for coffee. I stood, stretched my legs, and slung my rifle back over my shoulder. We started making our way down the hill toward where the ATV was parked. We didn't talk, just moved quietly down the narrow path. I always tried to match my dad's footsteps exactly. It was something he taught me when I was younger, to step when he stepped so we made less noise. The ground was covered in a thin layer of leaves, and our steps made that soft crunching sound that carried just far enough to remind you how empty the woods were. About halfway down, I started to notice something strange. Every time we took a step, there was another sound. It was faint, but it was there, just slightly off from our rhythm. It wasn't the echo of our steps either. It was the sound of something else moving when we moved. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal following us, something like a deer or maybe a raccoon. But animals don't usually walk in sync with people. They pause, stop, move faster or slower. This was different. It was matching us, step for step, but always a little off, just enough for me to notice. I stopped and looked around. The woods were still shaded from the hill, the sun barely reaching through the trees, and everything had that gray, muted color to it. I stared uphill into the thicker part of the woods, but I couldn't see anything. My dad kept walking a few paces ahead, and I hurried to catch up. We went another 50 yards before it happened again. The same faint crunch behind me, matching my footsteps, like someone walking just out of sight. I turned quickly this time and scanned the slope. For a few seconds I didn't see anything. Then about 30 yards up, something moved behind a tree. It was fast, like someone ducking out of sight. My first thought was that one of the other hunters had come onto the wrong hill, even though the schedule made that impossible. I stared hard at the tree and then I saw it, a pale face peeking out from behind the trunk. It wasn't far away. I could see that the skin looked almost white in the shadow, and the eyes were dark, like black holes. It stayed there for a few seconds before pulling back out of sight. I felt frozen in place. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The cold in the air suddenly didn't matter because I could feel sweat forming under my jacket. I took a slow step backward, still staring up the hill, and then the face appeared again, a little lower, watching. It wasn't moving like an animal would. It was standing, upright, too still. Then it ducked behind the tree again, and I could hear the faint scrape of something against bark. My dad had stopped ahead of me and was looking back, and when he turned his head to follow my gaze, he saw it too. That's when he motioned toward the ATV, and I knew we needed to get out of there fast. As we started moving again, I kept looking back up the hill. I didn't want to take my eyes off it in case it moved closer. When we reached the ATV, I heard another noise, like branches breaking further up. I turned one last time and saw it step out from behind the tree. It was pale all over, not just the face. Its body looked twisted, hunched in a way that didn't seem natural, and its arms hung too low at its sides. The shoulders were narrow, and the way it moved made it look like every part of it was stiff, like it didn't know how to move right. It just stood there, staring down at us as we started the ATV. The sound of the engine filled the air, and the thing didn't flinch. As we drove away, I kept looking over my shoulder until the trees blocked it from view. The ride down felt longer than the trip up had, even though we were going faster. When we reached the shack, the door was still closed, and there were no other vehicles around. My dad shut off the ATV, and I could feel the silence again, like the whole forest was holding its breath. We got in the truck, loaded our gear, and left the property without saying a word. I didn't go back to those woods after that. Every time hunting season came around, I made up an excuse not to go. My dad went back the next year like nothing happened. He got a deer that morning and acted like everything was normal. But even now, years later, I still think about that thing we saw. I've tried to reason it out. Maybe it was someone trespassing, maybe a person with some kind of deformity, or a hunter wearing strange gear. But the way it moved, the way it stood, the way it watched us without making a sound, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel human. Sometimes, when I wake up early in the morning and everything is quiet and gray, I can still picture it standing there behind that tree, half hidden, watching. The woods around my cousin's land are thick, with thousands of places to hide, and I can't help but wonder how long that thing had been standing there before we saw it, or how many times it might have been watching other people without them ever knowing. I've hunted my whole life and spent countless hours in the woods, and I've never felt fear like that morning. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or anything like that, but I know what I saw, and I know the feeling it left me with. The woods were quiet before that day, but after it, they never felt quiet again. When I was about 10 years old, my family decided to go camping in Mark Twain National Forest. It wasn't a planned trip, not really. My stepfather had one of his impulsive ideas after a few beers that morning, and my mother, who always gave in to him to keep the peace, packed us up in a rush. We didn't make any reservations or choose a proper campground. We just drove until we found a place that looked quiet enough to pull off the road and set up for the night. It was getting late by the time we got there. The kind of late where the light in the sky turns that pale orange and gray color before the trees start swallowing it completely. The forest was thick, endless it seemed, full of tall oaks and maples, and the ground was littered with dead leaves that made soft crunching sounds under our shoes. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine, how it felt colder than I expected. We rushed to set up the tent before it got completely dark, but everything felt rushed and tense. My stepfather started cursing when he realized he'd forgotten a lantern, and the light from the car headlights was fading as the battery got weaker. My mother tried to calm him down, but he was already half drunk and snapping at her for every little thing. My sister and I stayed quiet, helping where we could, afraid to make things worse. By the time we finally got the tent up, night had fallen hard. It was one of those nights where there's no moon, or maybe there was, but it was hidden behind the clouds. Either way, it was pitch black. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and even the outlines of the trees seemed to disappear into the dark. The forest was alive with sounds, though. Crickets, frogs, the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that isn't really quiet, where every little sound feels louder because you can't see what's making it. My stepfather was angry that we didn't have light for a campfire. He didn't want to waste the car battery using the headlights anymore, so we sat in complete darkness. The only light came from the occasional flicker of his cigarette. I could see the tiny orange glow floating near where he sat, and the smell of smoke mixed with the damp air made my stomach turn. My mother didn't say much, just sat beside him, probably wishing we had stayed home. My sister and I lay inside the tent, the nylon walls thin enough to hear everything. The muttered curses, the occasional sound of him taking a swig from his bottle, and the forest noises all around us. Eventually, my stepfather came into the tent muttering something about sleeping it off. He smelled like alcohol and sweat, and when he collapsed into his sleeping bag, the whole tent shifted. No one said a word. We all just lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Time moved slow, so slow that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I tried to focus on the steady breathing of my mother and sister beside me, but even that wasn't enough to calm me. There was a tension in the air, a strange feeling like something wasn't right. Then we heard it, the sound of leaves rustling. At first it was faint, like a small animal moving through the underbrush. But it didn't stop. It went on, with a rhythm that didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. It was too steady, too deliberate. I remember freezing, staring into the darkness of the tent, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed far off at first, maybe somewhere deeper in the woods, but every few seconds it grew a little closer. I could tell my mother heard it too. Her breathing changed, slow and shaky. My sister squeezed the edge of her sleeping bag, trying not to move. My stepfather stayed silent, but I could tell he was awake. The sound of footsteps, or what I thought were footsteps, kept coming one after another through the dry leaves. Whoever or whatever it was didn't have a flashlight. There was no light moving between the trees, no glow, no sound of a vehicle nearby. Just slow, deliberate steps, getting closer to where we were. It's strange how time stretches when you're terrified. Every second felt like a minute. The sound would pause for a moment, then start again, each time closer, the leaves crackling underfoot. My mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon or even another camper trying to find their way. But the pattern of the movement didn't fit any of that. It wasn't scattered or erratic like in animals. It was slow and heavy, like a person walking carefully through the dark. When it got close enough that I could almost picture someone standing just beyond the thin fabric of the tent, the sound stopped. Total silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I thought maybe it had been my imagination, that maybe the forest had just been playing tricks on me. But then came the sharp, unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. It was so close it felt like it came from right outside the tent. Before I could even process what was happening, my stepfather suddenly screamed, a loud, raw, panicked scream that I had never heard from him before. He wasn't the type of man who got scared of anything, but that scream didn't sound like anger or surprise. It sounded like pure fear. My mother yelled for us to get out, her voice shaking. Everything after that happened fast. We tore out of the tent, tripping over the stakes and each other, our hands grabbing at anything in the dark. I could feel branches scratching my arms as we ran, the cold air burning my lungs. The car wasn't far, but in the dark it felt like miles. I remember the sound of my feet hitting the ground, the crunch of leaves, and the pounding of my heart. My sister was ahead of me, and I could hear my mother's labored breathing somewhere to my left. My stepfather was already at the car, fumbling with the keys. When the engine finally started, the headlights cut through the darkness for just a second, and I caught a glimpse of the forest behind us. Nothing but trees, empty and still, as if nothing had been there at all. We drove off fast, the tires spitting gravel as the car bounced along the dirt road. No one spoke the whole way home. The headlights carved tunnels through the blackness of the forest, and every shadow outside made me flinch. I remember looking out the back window, half expecting to see someone following us down the road, but there was nothing there. Just the dark. We never went back for our tent or the rest of our things. My stepfather didn't mention that night again, and neither did my mother. It was like an unspoken rule that we'd all agreed on, to just forget it happened. But I couldn't forget. I still can't. Even now, decades later, I can still hear that sound sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The slow crunch of footsteps through dead leaves, steady and deliberate, getting closer each second. I'm 43 now, and I still dream about that night. In the dreams, I'm always back in that tent, lying awake in the dark, waiting for that sound to start again. It always does. And just before I wake up, I hear the twig snap, the same sharp crack that ended the silence all those years ago. It's not the kind of memory that fades. It stays, buried just deep enough to let me think I've forgotten, until it comes back. And when it does, it feels like I'm 10 years old again, lying in that forest, holding my breath in the dark, knowing something or someone was only a few feet away. We had been planning that trip for weeks. My friend and I both worked long hours, and the idea of getting away for a couple of nights in Sequoia National Park felt like the reset we both needed. I liked driving late, mostly because I enjoyed the quiet of the road and how empty the highways became past midnight. There was something calming about it, especially when I knew that by the time I arrived, I'd be surrounded by nothing but trees, cold air, and silence. We packed light, just the tent, sleeping bags, a cooler, and some small gear for cooking. By the time we left the city, it was already around 10 p.m. The streets were mostly empty, and the air outside was cool. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy but clean, and the headlights stretched far ahead into darkness that swallowed everything else. The drive toward Sequoia was peaceful at first. The hum of the tires against the asphalt had a rhythm that almost put me in a trance. Every once in a while, the faint light of a house would pass by, or the dull glow of a street light would fade into the distance behind us. My friend eventually fell asleep. His head leaned against the window, while I stayed focused on the road. The deeper we got into the mountains, the fewer signs of life there were. The air got colder, the trees taller, the road narrower. The only sound was the engine and the faint rush of wind sneaking through the small gap in the window. Around 1 a.m, we hit the main road that led into the park. It wound upward through tall trees and steep slopes on both sides. The darkness felt thicker there. My high beams cut across the winding path, catching the edges of guardrails and glinting off wet patches of asphalt. I was slowing down around a curve when I noticed something odd ahead. A strange shimmer that didn't look like a reflection from a sign or a road marker. It flickered in the beam of the headlights, like something metallic but moving slightly. At first I thought it might be an animal's eyes catching the light, but as I got closer the shape became clearer, and I realized it wasn't eyes at all. It was something big, with a rounded shape and a pale body. When I finally got close enough, I realized it was a cow. A full-grown cow standing dead still right in the middle of the road, its head low and turned slightly away from me. The sight was so out of place it almost didn't register at first. A cow, way up here, in the middle of a steep mountain pass, miles from any farm or open land that could support livestock. The road was surrounded by dense forest, and the slopes on both sides were too steep for anything like that to climb. I slowed almost to a stop, just staring at it. It looked healthy, not starved or injured, but its stance was off. Its legs were stiff, like it had been standing there for hours. The weirdest thing was how quiet it was. Usually, animals flinch or move when headlights hit them, but it didn't even blink. I crept forward a little more until I was maybe 20 feet away. The smell hit me next, an earthy, sour scent that wasn't quite right. It wasn't rot exactly, but something close, like wet hay mixed with decay. The cow's hide looked shiny from the moisture in the air, and when I looked closer, I noticed patches of its fur were missing, almost like it had been scraped or burned off. The skin underneath looked raw in spots. I felt a sharp unease crawl through my chest, the kind that makes you aware of your breathing. I eased the car to a stop completely, just sitting there with the headlights shining on the animal. My friend stirred awake then, confused and groggy, and the first thing he did was stare out the windshield, probably thinking he was still dreaming. The cow shifted slightly, one leg dragging forward, its head lowering even more, but its movements were slow, unnatural. I remember the sound its hoof made on the asphalt, soft but scraping, like the weight behind it wasn't balanced. I realized then that something was seriously wrong with it. The eyes caught my headlights finally, and that's when I saw that they were pale and clouded over. It wasn't looking at me, not really seeing at all. It must have been blind or nearly so. For a few seconds I sat frozen, trying to make sense of how something like that got there. There were no nearby farms, no cattle crossings, nothing that explained it. I decided to drive around it, but the road was narrow and the slope on the right side dropped off steeply. I had to inch forward, wheels close to the edge, while keeping an eye on the cow to make sure it didn't suddenly move toward the car. As I passed, the beam of my headlights washed across its side, and that's when I noticed something that still sticks in my head to this day. There were deep marks along its flank, like long parallel gouges that went from its shoulder down toward its hind leg. They were dark, crusted, and old, but not healed. It looked like something had torn through it weeks ago. There was no fresh blood, but the skin was puckered and uneven. I could see ribs pressing against the surface where muscle should have been. I didn't stop to look any longer. I eased around it, and once I was past, I accelerated just enough to get distance between us. In the mirror, I could still see its shape standing in the middle of the road until the trees curved and blocked the view. I remember the silence that filled the car after that. Not even the radio or my friend saying anything. Just the steady hum of the tires and the growing feeling that we had seen something we weren't meant to see. We got to the campsite about 30 minutes later. The air there was colder, the smell of pine sharp and heavy. I tried to shake off the image of the cow as we set up the tent, but it stuck with me. Every time the flashlight caught a tree or rock, I half expected to see that same pale shape staring back. I barely slept that night, listening to the creaks and distant sounds of the forest. Every crunch of leaves made my chest tighten. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something heavy moving along the distant road. Slow, dragging sounds, but I convinced myself it was wind or my imagination. The next morning, I forced myself to check. I walked back along the trail that connected to the main road. The sun was barely up, mist still clinging to the trees. When I reached the road, there was no sign of the cow. No tracks, no smell, not even a patch of disturbed dirt near the shoulder. It was like it had never been there at all. But about 50 feet further down, I noticed something small and dark in the gravel, part of a broken ear tag, the kind used for livestock. The metal was bent and rusted, like it had been there a long time. There were faint brown stains near it that looked like dried blood, but old, faded into the dirt. Later that morning, I asked one of the park rangers at the station if they ever had problems with livestock getting into the park. He told me that years ago, before stricter fencing laws, some cattle used to wander up from nearby ranches, but that hadn't happened in decades. The slopes were too steep now, and the fences extended for miles. He said if I saw one, it must have been a stray from some private property way down the valley, though he couldn't imagine how it got that far up without breaking its legs on the climb. That explanation made sense enough to end the conversation, but it didn't feel right. The way that animal had looked, the scars, the cloudy eyes, the stiffness, it wasn't just a stray cow. It looked like something that had been through hell and somehow wandered where nothing alive should have reached. On our way back home that Sunday, I half expected to see it again, standing in that same spot, waiting. But the road was empty and the air was still. The only thing left was the faint smell of wet pine and the endless silence of the mountain. Even now, when I think about that night, I still see the glint of its eyes in my headlights and the way it stood there, quiet and broken, miles from anywhere it could have belonged. When I was about 10 years old, my family decided to go camping in Mark Twain National Forest. It wasn't a planned trip, not really. My stepfather had one of his impulsive ideas after a few beers that morning, and my mother, who always gave in to him to keep the peace, packed us up in a rush. We didn't make any reservations or choose a proper campground. We just drove until we found a place that looked quiet enough to pull off the road and set up for the night. It was getting late by the time we got there. The kind of late where the light in the sky turns that pale orange and gray color before the trees start swallowing it completely. The forest was thick, endless it seemed, full of tall oaks and maples, and the ground was littered with dead leaves that made soft crunching sounds under our shoes. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine, how it felt colder than I expected. We rushed to set up the tent before it got completely dark, but everything felt rushed and tense. My stepfather started cursing when he realized he'd forgotten a lantern, and the light from the car headlights was fading as the battery got weaker. My mother tried to calm him down, but he was already half drunk and snapping at her for every little thing. My sister and I stayed quiet, helping where we could, afraid to make things worse. By the time we finally got the tent up, night had fallen hard. It was one of those nights where there's no moon, or maybe there was, but it was hidden behind the clouds. Either way, it was pitch black. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and even the outlines of the trees seemed to disappear into the dark. The forest was alive with sounds, though. Crickets, frogs, the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that isn't really quiet, where every little sound feels louder because you can't see what's making it. My stepfather was angry that we didn't have light for a campfire. He didn't want to waste the car battery using the headlights anymore, so we sat in complete darkness. The only light came from the occasional flicker of his cigarette. I could see the tiny orange glow floating near where he sat, and the smell of smoke mixed with the damp air made my stomach turn. My mother didn't say much, just sat beside him, probably wishing we had stayed home. My sister and I lay inside the tent, the nylon walls thin enough to hear everything, the muttered curses, the occasional sound of him taking a swig from his bottle, and the forest noises all around us. Eventually, my stepfather came into the tent, muttering something about sleeping it off. He smelled like alcohol and sweat, and when he collapsed into his sleeping bag, the whole tent shifted. No one said a word. We all just lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Time moved slow, so slow that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I tried to focus on the steady breathing of my mother and sister beside me, but even that wasn't enough to calm me. There was a tension in the air, a strange feeling like something wasn't right. Then we heard it, the sound of leaves rustling. At first it was faint, like a small animal moving through the underbrush. But it didn't stop. It went on and on with a rhythm that didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. It was too steady, too deliberate. I remember freezing, staring into the darkness of the tent, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed far off at first, maybe somewhere deeper in the woods, but every few seconds it grew a little closer. I could tell my mother heard it too. Her breathing changed, slow and shaky. My sister squeezed the edge of her sleeping bag, trying not to move. My stepfather stayed silent, but I could tell he was awake. The sound of footsteps, or what I thought were footsteps, kept coming, one after another, through the dry leaves. Whoever or whatever it was didn't have a flashlight. There was no light moving between the trees, no glow, no sound of a vehicle nearby. Just slow, deliberate steps, getting closer to where we were. It's strange how time stretches when you're terrified. Every second felt like a minute. The sound would pause for a moment, then start again, each time closer, the leaves crackling underfoot. My mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a deer, or a raccoon, or even another camper trying to find their way. But the pattern of the movement didn't fit any of that. It wasn't scattered or erratic like an animal's. It was slow and heavy, like a person walking carefully through the dark. When it got close enough that I could almost picture someone standing just beyond the thin fabric of the tent, the sound stopped. Total silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I thought maybe it had been my imagination, that maybe the forest had just been playing tricks on me. But then came the sharp, unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. It was so close it felt like it came from right outside the tent. Before I could even process what was happening, my stepfather suddenly screamed, a loud, raw, panicked scream that I had never heard from him before. He wasn't the type of man who got scared of anything, but that scream didn't sound like anger or surprise. It sounded like pure fear. My mother yelled for us to get out, her voice shaking. Everything after that happened fast. We tore out of the tent, tripping over the stakes and each other, our hands grabbing at anything in the dark. I could feel branches scratching my arms as we ran, the cold air burning my lungs. The car wasn't far, but in the dark it felt like miles. I remember the sound of my feet hitting the ground, the crunch of leaves and the pounding of my heart. My sister was ahead of me, and I could hear my mother's labored breathing somewhere to my left. My stepfather was already at the car, fumbling with the keys. When the engine finally started, the headlights cut through the darkness for just a second, and I caught a glimpse of the forest behind us. Nothing but trees, empty and still, as if nothing had been there at all. We drove off fast, the tires spitting gravel as the car bounced along the dirt road. No one spoke the whole way home. The headlights carved tunnels through the blackness of the forest, and every shadow outside made me flinch. I remember looking out the back window, half expecting to see someone following us down the road. But there was nothing there. Just the dark. We never went back for our tent or the rest of our things. My stepfather didn't mention that night again, and neither did my mother. It was like an unspoken rule that we'd all agreed on, to just forget it happened. But I couldn't forget. I still can't, even now, decades later. I can still hear that sound sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The slow crunch of footsteps through dead leaves. Steady and deliberate, getting closer each second. I'm 43 now, and I still dream about that night. In the dreams, I'm always back in that tent, lying awake in the dark, waiting for that sound to start again. It always does. And just before I wake up, I hear the twigs snap, the same sharp crack that ended the silence all those years ago. It's not the kind of memory that fades. It stays, buried just deep enough to let me think I've forgotten, until it comes back. And when it does, it feels like I'm 10 years old again, lying in that forest, holding my breath in the dark, knowing something, or someone, was only a few feet away. I woke up to the sound of water moving close by. It wasn't the calm lapping that usually came from the lake near my tent. This was heavier, more deliberate, and carried a rhythm that made my chest tighten before I even opened my eyes. I lay still in my sleeping bag listening, the soft splash of large paws pushing through water, then the faint huff of breath. A bear was swimming toward my camp. I could hear the sound of dripping when it climbed out onto the bank, the water falling off its thick fur in steady streams. The air outside was cold and still, the early morning kind where the fog sits low and sound travels too well. I didn't move, not even to reach for the spray near my head. I just lay there breathing slow, trying to tell myself it was passing through. The noise shifted, soft padding on wet ground, then the unmistakable sound of sniffing. The bear was close, moving around the tent, checking what was inside. I could hear it draw in a deep breath and release a low grunt. It stood there for what felt like an hour before finally wandering back down toward the water. I listened to the splash as it entered again, the steady rhythm of swimming fading away across the lake until it was gone. I didn't move for a long time after that. Later that week, I was out in the field, hiking through dense alder thickets, marking vegetation plots for a habitat survey. It was quiet, just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird calling from somewhere high up. I had been alone most of the day, following a GPS track that wound through low terrain near a creek bed. At some point, I started to notice the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The sound behind me wasn't just branches moving, it had weight. I stopped and listened. The silence stretched, then came a faint sniff, then another, soft but close. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw them. A sow and her cub, maybe 15 meters behind me, standing in the brush, both watching me. They had followed my trail right up the creek bed, their noses still twitching in the air. The cub was small, but the mother's head looked huge among the green leaves. My heart started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew not to run, not to make any sudden move. I started backing away, slow and steady, keeping my eyes on her but not locking my gaze. She huffed once, a deep, short exhale that sent a puff of mist into the air. I kept backing until the trees swallowed her from view. I didn't turn around until I had put 200 meters between us. For the rest of that day, every stick breaking under my boots sounded like it came from something behind me. A week later, I was camped on the coast, a small tent tucked above the tide line. There was a dead moose not far away, half buried in the sand where the tide had covered it days ago. I had boated past it earlier and knew it would draw something in, but it was too late to move camp once I realized how close I'd set up. That night, a storm pushed in and the wind kept shifting. Around midnight, I woke to heavy breathing outside the tent. It was deep and wet, and I could hear the crunch of gravel as something circled. I knew the smell before I placed it, musky, foul, mixed with salt. I unzipped the flap just enough to look through the mesh. A large wounded boar stood a few yards away, its fur clumped with sand and dried blood. It must have lost the moose to another bear and come looking for scraps. I yelled and clanged pots, did everything to drive it off. It backed away, pacing near the water line, then turned and came right back, Again I scared it off. Again it returned, over and over. Each time it came closer, its movement slower, its breathing louder, like it was too stubborn or too hungry to give up. Eventually, near dawn, it wandered off for good, disappearing into the surf. When I packed up in the morning, I saw the prints everywhere, overlapping, circling. Almost a map of how many times it had come back to test me. A few months later, I was stationed in a small plywood cabin deep in the park. It was built decades ago, just a single room with a cot, a stove, and a window that didn't shut all the way. The wind picked up one evening, and by midnight it was howling hard enough to make the walls flex. I'd heard of willowaws before, those sudden violent gusts that come screaming down from the mountains. But I'd never been caught in one like this. The air outside roared like a jet engine, and every few seconds loose pumice slammed against the siding. The building shook each time, a heavy thud followed by a shudder that ran through the floorboards. The stovepipe rattled, the tin roof groaned, and every gust felt like it might rip the whole cabin off its foundation. I sat awake for hours, flashlight on, counting the seconds between each gust. The air inside smelled like dust and cold wood, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest. By the second night, I stopped trying to sleep. The storm had stripped the hillside bare, and pumice kept hammering the window like handfuls of gravel. When the wind finally eased after 48 hours, I walked outside and saw the ground scoured clean, every loose thing buried under a thin layer of volcanic grit. The silence afterward felt almost unreal. There was another time, crossing a glacial river with a 50-pound pack strapped tight. The water was gray, fast, and colder than anything I'd ever felt. Each step sank into shifting gravel, the current pushing hard against my knees. I leaned on my trekking pole, watching the milky water surge around it. One slip and the river would take me under the ice-cold surface, and that would be it. I took each step slow, feeling for solid footing. Halfway across, the current picked up, and the pressure against my legs grew stronger. I could feel my boots losing traction. My arms started to shake from the cold and the weight of the pack pulling me backward. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, until finally the water dropped below my knees and I stumbled onto the opposite shore. My legs burned from the cold, and I sat there for a long time breathing, staring at the rushing water that had almost taken me. But none of those moments matched the silence that came when I was in the air. Flying back from a remote survey site late one afternoon, the mountains stretched out in every direction, glaciers cutting deep into the valleys, rivers winding through tundra far below. I was flying a small single-engine plane, the kind that feels more like an extension of your body than a machine. The fuel gauge had been low, but still in the safe range. I was maybe 30 minutes from the airstrip when I felt a small sputter. Then another. The engine coughed once and went silent. The propeller slowed, the noise fading into nothing. For a second, I couldn't believe it. Just the sound of wind rushing past the windows and my own breathing filling the space. The quiet was the worst part, so complete it felt unnatural. I trimmed the plane, checked the gauge again, and realized the tank was empty. Somehow, I had misjudged it. Below me stretched miles of broken terrain, no clearings, no roads, no easy place to land. My hands shook on the controls as I scanned for anything. An open riverbank, a sandbar, a patch of tundra that looked flat enough. I found one barely big enough to try for. I dropped altitude fast, heart pounding, every muscle locked. The airframe shuddered as I lined up. I hit hard, the landing gear digging into the soft ground, and the plane bounced once before slamming down again. It skidded, tilting sideways, and stopped just before a shallow creek. The silence after that was complete. I sat there, staring out the windshield, unable to move for a long time. The tundra stretched to the horizon in every direction. I could see mountains far away, snow still on their tops. I stepped out, felt the wind hit my face, and realized how small I was out there. The plane was intact, but the fuel tanks were bone dry. I radioed for help, and it took hours before another Ranger plane found me. When they finally did, I watched it circle overhead and felt the weight lift off my chest. I'd dealt with bears, storms, cold rivers, and isolation, but nothing had ever made me feel as powerless as that silence in the air when the engine died. In that moment, everything else, the fear of being followed, the sound of claws in the dark, the roar of the wind, felt simple by comparison. Because at least then there was still something I could do. Up there, when the sound stopped, I realized how thin the line really was between being alive and being gone, and how easily it could vanish with the quiet click of an empty tank. I camped alone in Sequoia National Park last fall, somewhere off one of those smaller dirt roads that split from the main park drive. I had my old pickup, a cooler, a sleeping bag, and a tarp, and I planned to just sleep in the bed of the truck for the night. The day had been long, and I remember the air turning cooler as the light faded. The forest there has this strange stillness at night, a kind of quiet that feels deeper than anywhere else I've ever been. I parked near a small clearing surrounded by giant trees that rose like dark walls around me. Before turning in, I climbed up a big boulder just behind my truck to look at the stars. The sky was wide open above the trees, and the Milky Way looked like smoke drifting across the black. While sitting up there, I noticed something carved into the rock. There were shallow, smooth depressions, perfectly rounded, like bowls. Nearby, I found long, thin grooves running down the stone like someone had spent years sharpening tools or weapons there. I knew enough to realize they were probably Native American grinding and sharpening spots, the kind used for food or tools hundreds of years ago. I ran my fingers over them, and the rock felt warm from the day's sun, even though the air had turned cold. There was something heavy about it, a strange stillness in the way the ground felt under my knees. I stayed there for a while, just listening to the night and watching the stars blink. Eventually I climbed down, brushed off the dust, and crawled into my sleeping bag in the truck bed. I remember how the air smelled, pine, dry earth, and a faint sweetness from the sap. The only sounds were the distant creaks of trees and the occasional movement of small animals in the brush. I fell asleep fast, but it didn't feel like normal sleep. It was like slipping under something thick, like falling into a current that I couldn't fight. I don't know exactly when the dream began, but I remember thinking I had woken up. My eyes opened and I was lying in my sleeping bag, but I wasn't in my truck anymore. The metal bed was gone, and the ground beneath me felt damp and uneven. The air was colder, heavier. I could smell soil, wet and raw, and a strange rot that stuck in my throat. I sat up halfway and saw trees around me, tall ones crowding close. It was pitch black except for a dim bluish light that seemed to come from nowhere. I didn't see my truck, my cooler, or anything familiar. When I turned my head to the left, I froze. The ground there wasn't still. It was moving. At first, I thought the shadows were just shifting with the wind, but then I realized what I was seeing. It looked like hundreds of black, eel-like snakes, all writhing together in a thick line that stretched through the forest floor. They were moving with purpose, sliding through the dead leaves, their slick bodies twisting over each other in silence. The sound they made was faint, like dry leaves rubbing together, but multiplied 100 times. It was soft, almost hypnotic. My first thought was to get away, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like I was buried in sand. I tried to kick my legs inside the sleeping bag, but they barely responded. The snakes kept coming, the mass of them curving in a line that passed just inches from where I lay. Then one of them lifted its head, and I saw the dull shine of scales and a thick, triangular shape. It wasn't like the others. It was a rattlesnake larger than any I'd ever seen. It turned toward me, and I heard the faint rattle, a dry buzzing sound that seemed to vibrate right in my chest. Then it struck, hitting the side of the sleeping bag, its head jerking back and forth like it was trying to break through the fabric. I kicked at it hard once, twice, but it didn't seem to move like a real thing. It just dissolved back into the black, sliding into the river of snakes again. I followed the movement of the writhing line, trying to see where they were all going. That's when I noticed what was behind me. My head was resting against something soft, something large. When I turned to look, I saw a dark shape lying on the ground. It took me a second to understand what it was. A horse, black, massive, lying on its side, its stomach split open like someone had taken a knife straight through it. The skin and muscle were peeled back, and the snakes were crawling inside the open cavity, disappearing one by one into the dark flesh. Steam was rising from it, a faint mist that mixed with the smell of blood and decay. I could see the faint glisten of organs, and the air was so thick I could almost taste the iron in it. That sight hit me harder than anything I'd ever seen. The feeling that came over me wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, like my body recognizing something it wasn't meant to see. My heart started pounding so hard that I could hear it echoing in my ears. I tried to push myself away to crawl backward, but the ground seemed to shift under me like wet sand. The sound of the snakes got louder, and I could feel some of them brushing against the outside of my sleeping bag, sliding past my legs and shoulders. I tried to yell, but no sound came out. Then it felt like everything collapsed in on itself. The forest, the light, the sound. It was like being pulled through a tunnel. I remember a heavy drop in my stomach, the kind you get when you fall in a dream. My eyes shot open and I was in my truck again, sitting upright in the sleeping bag, sweating and gasping for air. The sky above was still black, the stars faintly visible through the treetops. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I climbed out of the truck bed, my legs weak, and just stood there in the cold night air trying to convince myself I was awake. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the driver's seat until dawn, watching the light slowly rise through the trees. Everything around me looked normal. The boulder, the dirt road, the tall sequoias swaying gently in the wind. When I finally worked up the nerve to climb back onto that boulder in the morning, the carvings were still there, the old mortar bowls and grooves just as I'd seen them. I pressed my hand against one of the shallow depressions and felt how cold the stone had become overnight. I don't believe in ghosts, and I never have. But that dream felt different from any dream I've ever had. It didn't feel like something my mind invented. It felt older, like I had stumbled into a memory that didn't belong to me. Maybe it was just my brain trying to process the quiet, the isolation, the strange energy of that place. Or maybe it was something left behind, something tied to that rock and the people who once stood there, sharpening their tools under the same sky. Either way, I've never camped there again. Every now and then, when I wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, I can still see that line of black snakes moving through the dark, sliding toward something unseen. And each time, I have to remind myself that I'm awake, that it was just a dream, though it never really feels like one. I still remember that night like it happened yesterday. I must have been around 10 years old, maybe 9, and my friend and I had gone camping with our families at this big forested park about an hour out of town. It was one of those campsites that wasn't too crowded, just a few tents scattered near a lake, and you could hear the crickets all around when the sun went down. The air smelled like pine and smoke from the campfires. It was the kind of night that felt calm and endless. And even though we were kids, we felt safe because our parents were close, and the woods didn't seem dangerous. After dinner, we both got restless. The fire was dying down, and the adults were just sitting around talking, so we decided to explore the woods a little. We told them we were just going to walk a bit and come right back. It didn't seem like a big deal. The night sky was so clear that you could see every single star, and the air had that sharp, cold edge to it that makes everything sound louder. Every step we took on the dirt path crunched under our shoes. The trees were tall and crowded close together, their branches moving slightly with the wind. We didn't go far, maybe 5 minutes from camp, but once we got away from the light of the fire, everything around us turned darker and quieter. It felt exciting at first. We could hear frogs croaking somewhere near the lake and the sound of leaves moving when some small animal darted through them. We kept shining the flashlight around, catching glimpses of tree trunks, rocks, and flashes of eyes from little animals. The beam of the light would bounce off their eyes and make them glow for a second before disappearing again. It made us laugh. There was something strange but fun about being that deep in the dark, away from everyone, hearing the forest move around us. After a while, we decided to head back. The cold started to creep into my hands, and I realized how dark it had gotten. The stars were still bright above, but they didn't help much on the trail. We started walking back, and that's when I got this strange feeling, like we weren't alone anymore. It came out of nowhere, just that heavy awareness you get when you know something's near you. At first I thought it was just my imagination, because the woods have a way of making your mind play tricks when it's quiet. But then I heard it, the sound of something behind us. It wasn't loud at first, just the soft noise of leaves crunching, like someone walking a few paces behind. I slowed down and listened. The sound stopped too. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't sound like one. It was too steady, too heavy. We started walking faster, and then the sound started again, matching our steps. That's when I turned around and told my friend to point the flashlight behind us. When she swung the light back, the beam caught something in the distance between the trees. At first, it didn't make sense what I was seeing. It wasn't moving, just standing there, a dark shape about 20 or 30 feet away. The light wasn't strong enough to show any details, but I could see the outline of it clearly. Tall, maybe adult height, broad shoulders, the shape of arms hanging down. For a second, I thought it might have been one of our parents, but the campsite was in the opposite direction, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here behind us. That's when something deep in me, something instinctive, told me to run. It wasn't panic yet, just this solid, cold certainty that we needed to move right then. We turned and ran, pushing through the path, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my friend's hand. I could hear her breathing fast, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. But worse than that, I could hear the thing behind us. It wasn't walking anymore. It was running too. The sound of it crashing through the brush was loud and close, like branches snapping, heavy steps hitting the ground fast. It didn't sound like an animal. There was rhythm in the steps, like a person sprinting. I didn't dare turn around. The only thought I had was to make it back to the campfire light. I could see the faint orange glow ahead through the trees, and that gave me a bit of hope. Enough to keep running even when my legs started to ache. When we broke through the trees and hit the edge of the campsite, the noise stopped. Just stopped completely. I didn't look back right away. I bent over, trying to catch my breath, the cold air burning my throat. My friend was shaking, clutching the flashlight so tight her knuckles were white. The firelight looked so warm and safe after being in the dark like that. We didn't tell anyone what happened right then. We just sat by the fire, pretending everything was normal, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the trees. I kept expecting to see that dark shape again, standing at the edge where the light stopped. But nothing came out. The forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. That night I barely slept. Every small sound outside the tent made my heart race. I kept listening for footsteps or branches breaking, but there was nothing. Just the faint sound of the lake water moving and the wind slipping through the trees. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had followed us like a person would, not like something wild. The next morning, I went back to that part of the trail with my friend when the sun was up. We both wanted to see if there were any tracks or signs of what it might have been. The ground was covered in pine needles and soft dirt, and sure enough, there were footprints. Not paw prints, footprints, bare ones. They were larger than ours, spaced out like someone had been running. They led up the path and then stopped a few yards before the edge of camp, right where the trees started again. Seeing those prints made everything feel real in a way it hadn't the night before. It wasn't a monster, not some made-up thing our minds created. It was a person out there, barefoot in the woods, following two kids in the dark. We never told our parents about it. I don't even know why. Maybe we didn't want to get in trouble for wandering off. Or maybe we just didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But sometimes I still think about those footprints, how close they came to the campsite and how whoever it was stopped the moment we reached the light. I think about how they must have been watching us before we even heard them, waiting just far enough behind to stay out of sight. I don't know if they lived out there or were just passing through, but I know for sure that something human followed us that night, something that didn't want to be seen until it was too late. And the worst part is, I'll never know what would have happened if we hadn't started running when we did. I was 13 the first time I really started to notice how strange the woods could get at night. My family used to camp every summer in a national park a few hours from our home. It wasn't one of those big tourist parks where people filled the campgrounds and parked RVs next to each other like a small city. My parents preferred the quiet. They'd take us down old logging roads and find some random clearing far from anyone else. It always felt like we were alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of trees and still water. That year we found a spot that seemed perfect, right between two ponds. The road leading to it was more like a path by the time we got close. The forest had been reclaiming it for years. We had to stop the car when it got too rough and carry our gear the last stretch. I remember how thick the air felt as we hiked in. It was humid and filled with the smell of mud and wet grass. The sun was dropping behind the trees and the light was fading fast. The ground dipped and rose in small hills, and the weeds were high enough to brush our arms as we passed through. Fallen trees covered parts of the trail, and we had to climb over them one by one, balancing with the cooler in one hand and sleeping bags in the other. When we finally reached the small hill between the two ponds, the last of the light was fading. The surface of both ponds glowed faintly orange from the sky, and the air was full of the sound of frogs. It wasn't just a few croaks here and there. It was thousands of them, so loud and constant it sounded almost electric. It echoed between the ponds and off the trees until you could feel it in your chest. It was kind of amazing, like the whole place was alive. We set up camp right there on the hill. My dad pitched the tent while I gathered sticks and dead branches for the fire. My mom unpacked the food, and my little sister arranged her sleeping bag like she was setting up her own room. By the time darkness fell, the fire was going strong. The orange light flickered over the tents and trees while the frogs kept up their endless noise from both sides. It felt peaceful, like we had discovered our own hidden place. We stayed up late roasting marshmallows and just listening. Eventually, everyone turned in. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent ceiling, hearing the frogs through the thin fabric. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of engines. It started faint, like a low rumble far down the road, then got louder fast. The noise came from the direction we had walked in from earlier. It was after 2 a.m, pitch black outside except for our fire, which had burned down to a dim glow. The sound grew until it filled the woods, 2 engines revving hard, tires crunching over gravel and sticks. Headlights never appeared, but soon I could see the faint silhouettes of 2 massive trucks moving between the trees. They were big, like old black pickups with tall frames. I remember thinking there was no way those things could have made it that far on that overgrown road. But somehow they did. They pulled up close to the ponds, engines cutting off almost at the same time. Then the forest went dead quiet for a second. Even the frogs stopped. My heart was beating fast, but I couldn't move. I just lay there listening. Doors started opening. I counted them in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more, until I lost track. It sounded like a dozen or more people all moving at once. No one spoke. No flashlights, no laughter, no noise at all except for the soft splash of boots stepping into the water. I peered through the tent zipper and saw shapes, men walking in single file into the pond. They carried long nets and buckets. The water rippled around their legs as they started sweeping the nets through it, slow and methodical. Every few minutes, one of them would lift a net heavy with frogs, dump them into a bucket, then move to another section. I kept waiting for someone to say something, to yell at them or ask what they were doing, but no one did. My parents were awake too. I could hear them shifting in their sleeping bags, but they didn't go outside. The trucks stayed running quietly for a while, just idling, their dark bodies reflecting the faint starlight. For more than an hour, they kept working like that, completely silent except for the swish of nets and splashes of water. Then, just as suddenly as they came, they left. Buckets were carried back to the trucks. Doors slammed softly. Engines roared again, and the trucks drove off into the darkness. The sound faded into nothing. After that, the night felt wrong. The air seemed heavier. The frogs didn't start up again. Both ponds were completely still. It was like the life had been sucked out of them. I lay there for a long time listening for any sound at all, but there was nothing. No wind, no bugs, just silence so thick it made my ears ring. Eventually, I fell asleep again, uneasy and half awake the rest of the night. The next morning, sunlight came through the tent, and everything looked normal, but the ponds were quiet. The water was dark and unmoving, the surface broken only by an occasional ripple from a bug landing on it. It felt eerie to stand there and realize there wasn't a single frog sound. We walked around the edge of the ponds and found a few marks in the mud, boot prints, tire tracks, and small wet patches where the grass had been flattened. The only sign of what happened was a single frog sitting on a rock near the water. One of its legs looked bent or broken. It just sat there, barely moving, like it was too weak to jump. I remember feeling bad for it, so I picked it up gently and set it near the edge of the pond. It slipped into the water and disappeared, leaving a small ripple. The rest of the day was strange. We fished a little, cooked breakfast, tried to relax, but the silence never lifted. At night it stayed the same. The frogs never came back. It was like they'd all been erased. We went home after a few days. My parents didn't talk much about what happened. The next summer we came back to the park again, but we chose a different spot, somewhere miles away from those ponds. The first night was calm, nothing weird, until early morning when a black bear wandered into our camp. We woke to the sound of the cooler scraping across the ground. The bear had grabbed it by the handle and was dragging it off like it was nothing. Inside were beers and an open bag of marshmallows someone forgot to close. We watched from the tent as it carried the cooler into the trees. When we found it later, the marshmallows were gone and a few beer cans were crushed flat. It left everything else untouched. That incident almost felt funny compared to the year before. Bears were normal out there. People weren't. We never camped between the ponds again. Every time we passed near that area, we noticed how quiet it still was. The frogs never came back, at least not in any real number. Sometimes I think about those men, what they were doing, where they took all those frogs, and why they did it in the middle of the night without lights or words. It never made sense. It didn't feel like hunting or collecting for food. It felt organized, deliberate, like they were taking something specific they needed. The strangest part is how they didn't even look at us, like we weren't even there. Now whenever I go camping, I notice the small things most people ignore, the hum of insects, the croak of frogs, the rustle of water against the shore. When those sounds stop, even for a second, it makes my skin crawl, because I know what silence like that means. It means something's wrong. Something has already been there and taken what it wanted, and it doesn't care if you saw it happen. I work as a wetland biologist in Pennsylvania, and most of my field days are spent alone, knee-deep in muddy water or bushwhacking through dense understory. That day I was out on a site that was undergoing some restoration work. It was the kind of job that seemed straightforward on paper. Flag and map the wetland boundaries, note the seeps and springs, and trace how they connected to the old reservoir at the base of the mountain. The reservoir had once been part of a farm system, now mostly overgrown and forgotten. The area was quiet, thick with ferns and the smell of wet soil. The kind of place where every sound, bird wings, a stick snapping, echoes louder than it should. I parked my truck off a dirt access road and hiked in about 6 miles, carrying my flagging tape, GPS, and a shovel handle I used as a walking stick. The air had that damp heaviness of early fall. The leaves were starting to turn, and everything was slick underfoot. I remember the low hum of insects, the sound of water trickling through the moss, and how the ground would suddenly give way to soft pockets of muck that swallowed my boots almost to the ankle. I had been following one of the feeder channels uphill, trying to find the mainspring source. It wound through old stone foundations and rusted barbed wire half buried under vines, signs of what used to be someone's property decades ago. The woods up there were thick, the kind that feels older than the maps suggest. You could tell it had been logged a long time ago, but it had grown back in that uneven, wild way where every path looks the same. As I climbed higher, I noticed the ground started to flatten out. The seep channel spread into a wet meadow ringed by hemlocks. I stopped to mark a few points, took some photos, and checked my bearings. When I looked up again, I realized there was something odd ahead, a cluster of shapes through the trees that didn't fit the landscape. At first I thought it was just an old shed, but as I walked closer, I could see it was more like a collection of junk. Metal frames, old wood, a refrigerator tipped on its side. It looked like a makeshift camp. There were crushed beer cans, chewing tobacco tins, and torn tarps half covered with pine needles. A folding chair with its fabric rotted through. A metal bed frame tangled with vines. There were a few rusted-out cooking pots and the remains of a small fire pit, now filled with damp leaves. It had the kind of look that told me no one had been there for at least a few years, but not long enough for the forest to fully reclaim it. I've come across places like that before. Old hunting camps, squatters' spots, or where people would party deep in public land. I didn't think much of it. I turned to head back down toward the reservoir, but then I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. A German shepherd stood there maybe 20 yards away. Its coat was clean, shiny even, and its ears were up, watching me. It wasn't growling or barking. It just stared, unmoving. My first thought was that it belonged to someone nearby, maybe a hunter. But the area was closed for restoration, and there were no vehicles parked anywhere near the access point. I gripped the shovel handle a little tighter. A strange dog in the middle of the woods can be unpredictable, and it was big, easily over 70 pounds. I remember thinking, great, now I'm screwed if this thing decides to charge. But it didn't. It turned slightly, looked back into the woods behind it, then looked at me again, almost like it wanted me to follow. I don't know why I did. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe instinct. It kept glancing back as it moved uphill, pausing to make sure I was behind it. The trail wasn't really a trail, just a faint path where the underbrush was thinner. The dog moved quietly, confidently, like it knew the area well. I followed it for maybe another 100 yards. The woods grew darker there, with tall pines blocking most of the light. The air was cooler, and the ground was spongy with moss. Then I saw it. In a small clearing, there was a circle of dirt that looked like someone had cleared it intentionally. Around the perimeter were dozens of old dolls, 20 or 30 at least. They were buried up to their necks, their plastic faces poking out of the ground, arms raised toward the center. Their eyes were faded or missing, and most of them were cracked or sun-bleached. Some had tangled hair full of pine needles. They were all facing inward, their hands pointed toward something hanging in the middle. Suspended from a branch about 10 feet up was the carcass of a deer. The hide was mostly intact, but the ribs were exposed and the body had been looped up with cord in a way that looked deliberate, not the work of scavengers. Beneath it, the ground was stained dark, and the smell hit me a second later. A sour metallic stench of rot and old blood. For a few seconds I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like hunting. Hunters don't hang deer like that. Not that deep in the woods and not surrounded by a ring of dolls. There were no tools, no signs of someone processing it. Just that eerie setup like something meant to be seen. The dog had stopped beside me and sat down, watching me quietly. I felt my stomach twist. I turned around and started walking back the way I came. I didn't run, but my pace quickened. Every sound behind me made my nerves jump. The creak of branches, the faint rustle of leaves. I didn't look back at the clearing, didn't want to. The dog followed for a bit, then at some point it stopped. When I glanced back once, it was standing still between the trees, just watching. It took me longer than I thought to find the reservoir again. My GPS was glitching, the signal weak under the canopy. The whole time, I felt this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was walking parallel to me just out of sight. When I finally broke out of the woods and saw the open water, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. I walked straight to the truck, threw my gear in, and sat there with the door locked, listening to my own breathing until it slowed down. On the drive back, I kept replaying it in my head. The camp, the dog, the dolls, the deer. It didn't add up to anything that made sense. I didn't report it. There was no way to explain it without sounding unhinged, and I had my wedding coming up in a few weeks. I wasn't about to drag law enforcement out there over what could have been some backwoods lunatic's idea of art or ritual. I finished the job that week, turned in my maps, and never went back to that site. Every once in a while, when I'm working alone in another part of the state, I'll see a shape move between the trees and think of that German shepherd. The image of those dolls, their cracked faces and upturned hands, still sits in my mind, especially when I'm alone in the woods and the air feels too quiet. I've worked dozens of restoration sites since then, but that one, off Route 119 near I-81 South, isn't on my list anymore. I marked it done and left it behind. Some places, no matter what you find there, are better left to grow over again. I had been working as a park ranger in northern Idaho for about 6 years. When I got assigned to patrol an area around the upper Clearwater, drainage, a wide stretch of remote forest that barely anyone visited except for the occasional hunter or research crew. It wasn't one of those scenic tourist parks. It was raw country, steep ridges, dense timber, long stretches of overgrown trails, and more bears and cougars than people. Most of the time, I liked that kind of work. It was quiet, peaceful, and predictable. But there was one week up there that I still think about almost every night. It was late September, and the days were getting shorter fast. The weather was starting to turn, warm enough in the sun, but already freezing at night. My job that week was to inspect old logging roads for washouts and flag sections that were becoming unsafe for the restoration crew that would come through in October. I was based out of a small ranger cabin near a creek called Moose Fork. It was an old wooden structure built in the 1960s. No electricity except for a small generator, no running water. I spent most of my days hiking out to different drainages and coming back around dark. The first few days were normal. Long hikes, lots of flagging, a few moose sightings. But on the fourth day, I decided to check an old spur road that ran up a narrow valley above the North Fork. It hadn't been maintained for decades, and I had never actually been up there myself. It was on my list because the satellite map showed some small slides nearby, and we needed to see if it was worth reopening. I parked my truck near the base of the ridge, strapped my pack, and started walking up. The road had almost vanished under years of pine needles and alder growth. It curved along a steep slope where the ground was soft and damp. After about half a mile, the road began to climb, cutting along the hillside above a creek that I could hear, but not see through the brush. Every few minutes, I stopped to mark small erosion points with orange flagging tape. I was so focused on the ground that I barely noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual background sounds, birds, wind, insects, seemed gone. Around midday, I came to a clearing where the old road opened into a flat bench. The map said there used to be a small equipment yard there back in the 70s, when the area was logged. Sure enough, I found the remains of an old bulldozer half buried in moss and rust. It looked like someone had just walked away from it one day and never came back. I remember noticing how fresh the ground looked around it, like something had disturbed the top layer of needles. I figured maybe a bear had been digging around for grubs or something. I kept going uphill. The road faded completely, and soon I was just following the creek. The terrain got rougher. There were deep ruts, slick mud, and the smell of rotting vegetation. Around 2 in the afternoon, I reached a narrow section where the creek cut between 2 rocky slopes. I was going to stop there, eat lunch, and turn back. But just as I sat down, I saw what looked like a tarp or tent material tangled in the brush about 30 yards ahead. It looked faded and torn, half buried in mud. At first, I thought it was leftover debris from the old logging days. But when I got closer, I realized it was a modern backpacking tent, maybe a few years old, but not ancient. It had collapsed, and most of the poles were broken. I crouched down and noticed pieces of clothing and a small camping stove nearby. There was no sleeping bag, no food, no sign of anyone. That's when I felt something that made my skin crawl. The ground in that area smelled like rot. Not just from plants, but something more sour and sharp. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe an animal had died nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever owned that tent hadn't packed it up willingly. I looked around and saw faint boot prints in the mud leading away from the tent and up the creek. They were old, washed out, but still visible. I followed them slowly for about 50 yards until they vanished in a tangle of alder roots. That was where I stopped. The area just didn't feel right. The air was still, heavy, and it had that strange coldness that sometimes hangs over places where animals die. I decided to mark the spot and report it when I got back. I tied flagging to a nearby tree and wrote the coordinates in my notebook. Then I turned around and started heading back down the road. About 10 minutes later, I realized I couldn't hear the creek anymore. I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just dead silence. No water, no wind, nothing moving. That kind of silence doesn't happen naturally out there unless something big is nearby. I kept walking, trying not to think too much about it. But then I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The flags I had tied on my way up were gone. Every single one. I always use bright orange tape, and it's impossible to miss. But the branches where I'd tied them were bare, like they'd been pulled off. I tried to tell myself I'd just missed them, or that I was taking a slightly different path. But as I moved further down, I noticed boot tracks in the mud that weren't mine. They were deep, older than mine, but fresher than the ones near the tent. They were spaced irregularly, like someone had been walking fast or limping. By the time I got back to the clearing with the bulldozer, I was sweating, even though the air was cold. I felt like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't see or hear anything, but every sense in me was telling me not to stop. I walked faster, checking my GPS every few minutes just to make sure I was heading in the right direction. When I finally reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack in the bed and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. I felt sick. Not just from the hike, but from that deep unease that sticks in your stomach. That night back at the cabin, I tried to write my report but couldn't concentrate. Around midnight I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal noise, more like the crunch of boots on gravel, slow and steady. I turned off my lantern and listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the wall where my bed was. I didn't move. I just lay there staring at the ceiling until I eventually passed out sometime before dawn. In the morning, there were muddy footprints on the porch. Same pattern as the ones I'd seen near the creek. Wide heel, narrow toe, uneven stride. I packed up my gear, drove straight to the district office, and turned in everything I'd documented. They sent a search team out that afternoon. They found the tent, just like I described, but nothing else. No body, no personal ID, no sign of a struggle. The tracks were mostly washed out by rain. A few weeks later, a report came in from Fish and Game. Some hunters had found human bones about a mile further up the drainage. Partial remains, scattered along the creek bed. No clear cause of death. I never went back to that part of the forest. Officially, it was listed as an old missing hiker case, probably exposure or injury. But I know what I felt up there, that someone had been moving through those woods long after the tent had collapsed. Someone who didn't want that area found again. Even now, when I'm deep in the field and the woods go completely quiet, I can still feel that same pressure in the air, like something waiting just out of sight. I always leave when it happens. I don't wait to see what's causing it. Some places out there aren't meant to be walked alone, even if there's no ghost or monster to blame. Just people who never left, and the forest that learned to keep their secrets. I had been working as a park ranger in northern Montana for about 6 years when I got assigned to cover a remote section of the park called Birch Hollow. It was one of those stretches that never saw many visitors, too far from the main roads, too many rough trails, and too many warnings about black bears. The area was mostly forest and steep hills that dropped into a network of cold creeks and ravines. Birch Hollow wasn't dangerous on paper, but it was lonely. It was the kind of place where a person could walk for miles without hearing another human voice or seeing a single footprint besides their own. I was sent there to do a week-long wildlife survey and maintenance check before winter closures. That meant making sure trail markers were still up, checking the small wooden bridges for rot, and recording signs of animal activity. It was late September, and the air already had that thin, cold edge that comes before snow season. The forest floor was soft with layers of fallen leaves, and the mornings were full of fog that didn't burn off until noon. I was carrying a pack with enough food for a few days, a sleeping bag, my camera, and a GPS unit that only worked half the time in the dense woods. The first day went smooth. I set up camp near an old fire road where the land opened up a bit. I marked down several deer tracks, some fresh moose scat, and a few black bear prints. It was nothing out of the ordinary. The quiet was deep, so deep it almost pressed against my ears. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the aspens and the distant gurgle of water. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast, and I sat by my small camp stove writing notes by headlamp. The woods around me felt endless, and I kept glancing into the dark tree line out of habit. But there was nothing out there. On the second day, I headed north toward an area marked on the old ranger maps as Sector 12. It wasn't a popular hiking zone, and I don't think it had seen any major patrols for years. The terrain got rougher the farther I went. Steeper hillsides, tangled undergrowth, and a lot of fallen trees that made walking slow. Around noon I found something strange, a section of forest where all the underbrush had been cleared. It was maybe the size of a small cabin footprint. The ground was uneven and full of old ruts, like someone had driven machinery through there years ago. At the edge of it, half buried in dirt and moss, was an old rusted metal drum. It looked like an oil drum, but the paint was gone and the lid had been welded shut. There were a few more scattered around, almost in a line, leading down a slope. I guess they might have been part of some logging operation decades back. Still, they were too close to a wetland area for that to make much sense. I marked the location on my GPS and made a note to report it later. That night, I set up camp near a small creek below that hill. I remember how quiet it was again. So quiet I could hear the faint snap of twigs far away. I told myself it was elk or maybe a porcupine, but as the night went on, I started feeling something off. The air carried a faint metallic smell, like rust or blood, that seemed to come and go with the wind. My flashlight beam showed nothing but mist and trees, yet the smell lingered. The third day I went back to that open patch to take photos for the report. I noticed something I hadn't before. Deep, thin gouges in the trees around the clearing, almost like they'd been scraped by metal. The bark was torn in long vertical streaks, and the wood beneath had dark stains that had run down toward the ground. I leaned close to one and saw small bits of gray material stuck in the sap. It looked like shredded fabric or maybe plastic. The more I looked, the more I realized the ground had been disturbed recently. Leaves were brushed aside and there were boot prints, old ones, maybe weeks old, but definitely human. It made no sense because no one was supposed to be working out here anymore. The access road leading in had been closed for years. That evening, I moved my camp closer to the fire road again, figuring I'd head back early the next morning and log everything. But that night was worse. I barely slept. Every hour or so I woke to some noise, the crunch of leaves, faint snapping sounds, and once something heavy shifting through the brush. I sat up waiting, but the noise would stop as soon as I reached for my flashlight. The metallic smell came back again, stronger this time. It burned faintly in my nose, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the woods. By dawn, I decided I'd seen enough and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The forest felt wrong that morning, still, but tense. About halfway down the ridge, I caught sight of movement through the trees. At first, I thought it was another ranger or maybe a hunter, but it wasn't. It was a small structure hidden in a fold of the land. It looked like a shack made of old corrugated metal and wood. No markings, no path leading to it. It wasn't on any of my maps. I hesitated before going closer, but I needed to document it. The shack had no windows and only one warped door hanging on a single hinge. The roof was caved in near the back, and the walls were rusted through in spots. Inside there was an old cot, a couple of empty food cans, and what looked like pieces of equipment. Plastic tubs, a few glass bottles, and some stained rags. It reeked. The smell was that same metallic rot, stronger than ever. In one corner of the shack was another sealed drum, identical to the ones up the hill. This one had a dented side and something smeared across the top, dried dark brown. I backed out quickly, realizing this wasn't any kind of official site. Someone had been here, using the place for something, and whatever it wasn't part of the park's operations. I left fast, keeping to the trail as best I could. Every little sound set me on edge. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger truck parked near the boundary gate. I drove straight back to the field office, filed a detailed report, and included the GPS coordinates. 2 days later, the Park Service sent a small team out with law enforcement to check the area. When they came back, they told me the drums were filled with chemical waste, old industrial dumping from decades ago. The shack had signs someone had been living there recently, maybe scavenging or trying to salvage metal from the containers. They said there were also traces of human remains near one of the drums at the creek bed, partly buried and badly decomposed. The coroner couldn't determine much, but it looked like whoever had been there might have been exposed to the chemicals or tried to open one of the drums. The site was fenced off, and cleanup crews came in within a week. They told us to stay clear until the contamination levels dropped. I didn't argue. I never went back to Birch Hollow again after that. What stayed with me wasn't just the discovery or the danger of what I'd stumbled into. It was the realization that for all the time I'd spent out there alone, thinking I was the only person in miles, someone else had been there too, living quiet, hidden among the trees, surrounded by poison and silence. And for days, maybe weeks, I'd been walking right through the middle of their last home without ever knowing it. I worked as a park ranger for a national forest in northern Idaho for a few years. Most of my work involved checking the backcountry trails, repairing signs, clearing fallen trees, and monitoring fire danger. It was mostly quiet work, long hours spent alone in deep forest where the only sounds were wind, insects, and birds. I liked the solitude. But there was one part of the forest I started to avoid after something that happened in my third year on the job. Something that still comes back to me sometimes when I smell wet pine or diesel fuel. That summer had been dry, but a series of late storms had dumped a lot of rain, and the rivers swelled high enough to cut out sections of dirt road. One of the lesser-used Forest Service roads, an old one that hadn't been graded in years, had washed out badly. I was sent out to inspect the damage and mark it for repair crews. It was about 20 miles from the main ranger station, far from any maintained trail or campground, just endless hills and thick timber. The road wound up through steep country with switchbacks cut into the side of the mountain. By the time I reached the upper stretch, the air felt cooler, heavy with fog that rolled down from the peaks. I parked my truck near the end of the drivable section, right where the road collapsed into a muddy ravine. The rest of it was nothing but broken earth, tire-deep mud, and half-buried logs that had washed down in the storm. I grabbed my pack, GPS, and camera and started walking the damaged section to mark it on the map. The slope was slick and soft, and water was still trickling down from the upper ridge, carrying soil with it. I remember thinking how unstable it all felt, like the whole hillside was just waiting to slide. After about a quarter mile, I noticed the remains of an old logging spur cutting off the main road. It wasn't on my map, which wasn't uncommon. There were hundreds of old trails and spurs from when the forest was heavily logged decades ago. But something about this one caught my attention. The entrance was half hidden behind a tangle of alder and spruce, and the ground looked churned up, like someone had driven through recently. I crouched and saw the faint imprints of tire tracks. They weren't from our maintenance trucks, too narrow. It looked more like ATV or small pickup tires. I followed the tracks for a while, figuring maybe someone had been poaching or dumping. The spur road climbed steadily for maybe half a mile before opening up into a small clearing. The ground was bare except for a few blackened stumps and piles of old cut wood. The place looked abandoned, but there were fresh signs of activity. A blue tarp stretched between two trees, an extinguished campfire, and some crushed beer cans scattered in the mud. Someone had been staying there recently. I took some photos for the report, thinking I'd have to note it as an illegal camp. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something sour or rotting carried by the damp air. I figured maybe it was an old deer carcass nearby, which isn't rare. But as I walked around the clearing, the smell grew stronger. I followed it toward the back where the trees thickened again. The ground there dipped slightly, forming a shallow basin filled with dark mud and ferns. I stepped down into it carefully, pushing aside the wet growth. That's when I saw the edge of a black plastic sheet sticking out of the soil. It looked like a trash bag at first, half buried and torn. When I pulled back the layer of dirt and roots, I realized it wasn't just garbage. Inside the plastic were chunks of fabric, something heavy, and what looked like a section of boot sole. The smell hit me full force then, sweet and foul. I didn't need to look further to know it was human. My stomach turned, and I stepped back fast, trying to breathe through my sleeve. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to think clearly. There was no radio signal that far out, and the satellite phone was in my truck, nearly a mile back down the hill. I marked the GPS point and started back quickly. But as I was leaving the clearing, I noticed another set of tire marks. Fresher, pressed deep into the mud, facing downhill. Whoever had been here had probably left not long before I arrived. The forest was silent as I made my way down the spur, except for the sound of dripping water and the occasional crack of a branch. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be nearby, watching. Every so often I stopped and listened. Nothing but the soft hiss of rain starting again. When I reached the main road, I saw something that made my stomach sink even more. The tire prints from the spur continued past where I had parked. They went around my truck and down the hill, heading toward the main road out of the forest. I hadn't heard a vehicle leave, which meant it must have happened while I was in the clearing. Whoever had dumped that body had been there within minutes of me showing up. I drove back to the station fast, radioed it in, and a few hours later the sheriff's department and state police arrived with crime scene teams. They spent days up there, digging up more than one bag. From what I was told later, it was likely a missing person from a nearby county, someone who had been gone for months. No clear suspects, no arrests. What stuck with me most wasn't the discovery itself. It was how close I'd come to crossing paths with whoever did it. If I'd arrived just a bit earlier, I might have caught them there. Alone, unarmed, deep in the woods, with no one knowing exactly where I was. That thought bothered me for weeks afterward. Every time I went into the backcountry after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few months later, when the rains came again, that entire section of road slid completely off the hillside. The Forest Service decided not to rebuild it. It was too unstable, too remote to justify the cost. Now that part of the forest is closed off, swallowed by trees and landslide debris. If you drive past the old gate, you'd never know there was once a road or a clearing, or what was buried there. Sometimes, when I look at old maps, I trace my finger to where that spur used to be. I can still picture the smell of the wet soil, the sound of dripping water, and that quiet clearing under the gray sky. What unsettles me most is not what I found, but the thought that somewhere in those woods there might be more places like it, hidden beneath the ferns and mud, waiting for another storm to uncover them. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana for 3 summers, stationed in a remote section of the park that didn't get much tourist traffic. It was a rough forested stretch of land cut with narrow logging roads and old mining paths that had been reclaimed by trees and moss over the years. Most of my job involved patrolling those roads, checking the fire towers, and keeping an eye out for illegal camping or poaching. It was quiet work most of the time, and I liked it that way. I preferred being out there alone, away from the noise of people, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional call of a hawk echoing over the valley. That summer had been unusually dry. Every morning I'd scan the ridgelines for signs of smoke, making sure no small fires were starting. In mid-July, I was assigned to monitor an old service cabin near a decommissioned fire lookout on the north slope of the range. The cabin sat about 12 miles from the nearest road that a regular truck could manage. To get there, I had to use an ATV for part of the trip, then hike the last 2 miles along a faded game trail that wound through thick spruce and aspen. The cabin wasn't much, just a single room with a cot, a stove, and a hand pump outside. It hadn't been used regularly in years, but the park wanted to keep it from falling apart completely. I arrived there in the late afternoon, set down my gear, and checked the area. The place was quiet. The air smelled dry and heavy, like it hadn't rained in weeks. The ground around the cabin was covered with pine needles and dry leaves, and I noticed faint boot prints leading from the back of the cabin toward the tree line. They were old, the edges soft and faded, maybe from a hunter or another ranger months back. I didn't think much of it then. That night, I cooked a can of beans on the small stove and wrote in the logbook. The sun went down fast, the sky turning dark purple behind the ridge. When the light was gone, it was total blackness outside, the kind that swallows the forest whole. I could hear crickets, the occasional crack of branches, maybe deer moving through the brush. It was normal forest noise, and I tried not to read into any of it. Still, when I turned off my lantern, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods felt heavier than usual, like there was something still out there after the rest of the forest had gone quiet. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It was slower, heavier. It sounded like something dragging along the dirt near the pump. I stayed still for a while, listening. It moved again, closer to the wall near the window. I didn't have a weapon other than the small knife on my belt, so I just waited, trying to make sense of it. After a few minutes, it stopped completely. The forest went back to silence. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a black bear wandering through, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check around. There were tracks in the dirt near the pump, but not the kind I expected. They weren't paw prints or boot marks. It looked like something with the outline of a shoe had slid through the dust like a heel dragging. There were faint lines beside them, maybe from something being pulled. I followed the marks a few feet before they disappeared into the thick brush. The soil was too dry to hold much definition. It looked odd, but I told myself it could have been a fallen branch or an animal dragging something. I spent the rest of the day hiking the ridge to check for fire hazards. When I came back around sunset, I saw something that stopped me halfway down the trail. Near the side of the cabin, there was a shape, something pale leaning against a tree. As I got closer, I saw it was a torn canvas tarp. It must have been lying in the brush before, and maybe the wind had carried it up. But it was strange that I hadn't noticed it the day before. The tarp was old, with rusted metal grommets and stains on the fabric. I folded it up and set it beside the porch, thinking maybe I'd pack it out later. That night, the forest went silent again. No wind, no insects, just the creaking of the cabin settling in the cold air. Around 1 a.m., I heard the dragging sound again, this time behind the cabin. It was closer, slower. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. I could hear something brushing along the wall, then a soft, scraping sound like metal on wood. It lasted maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally went outside, I saw a mark on the wood siding near the back window. A long, thin scratch, fresh and pale against the darker surface. It looked like it had been made by something sharp, maybe a nail or a piece of metal. There were drag marks in the dirt again, too, leading off into the trees. My first thought was that maybe someone was out there, someone living off-grid or squatting near the ridge. There were stories about people like that, hiding deep in the woods where no one bothered them. Some were harmless, some weren't. I decided to hike the drainage behind the cabin to see if I could spot anything. The slope was steep, covered in ferns and fallen logs. About half a mile down, I found what looked like the edge of an old camp. There was a half-collapsed lean-to made of branches, and in front of it, a shallow pit filled with old cans and burned trash. I could tell it had been used years ago. Most of the metal was rusted through. But something about the pit looked disturbed, like someone had dug into it recently. The dirt was loose, not compacted like the rest. I crouched down and poked through it with a stick. Underneath the surface, I found a few scraps of fabric, darkened and stiff with age, and what looked like an old boot sole. I didn't dig further. When I got back to the cabin, I packed my things. I decided I wasn't staying another night. The radio wasn't picking up a signal, so I left a note in the logbook about what I'd found and started the hike back toward where I'd parked the ATV. The forest felt different that morning. Still quiet, but with that kind of silence that feels like it's listening. As I climbed the ridge, I looked back once. Near the base of the cabin steps where I'd left the folded tarp, there was something lying beside it. It looked like a piece of rope or maybe wire, but it wasn't there the day before. I didn't go back to check. When I reached the ranger station later that afternoon, I filed my report. They sent another ranger up the next week to check on the site. He radioed back saying there were signs of someone having camped nearby maybe months before, but nothing active. The cabin was left to stand empty again. A month later, one of the forest crews doing erosion checks near that same drainage found what looked like an old shallow grave, partly collapsed by rain. Inside were a few remnants of clothing, a metal canteen, and fragments of a human boot sole. They said the remains had likely been there for decades, maybe from an old miner or trapper who never made it out. But the part that bothered me was what they mentioned last. The edges of the grave weren't smooth. It looked like someone had recently dug into it, not too long before it was found. I never went back to that section of the park. Even now I think about those dragging sounds at night, the marks on the cabin, and the way the forest went completely still. I don't know if someone had been living out there or if they were just passing through, but I know this. Whoever it was, they had been close, watching. And when I left that morning, I don't think I was the first person to walk away from that place alive. I've worked as a park ranger in northern Montana for almost 15 years. Most of that time has been routine: trail maintenance, assisting lost hikers, wildlife checks, and seasonal monitoring. But a few years back, I got assigned to a remote section of the park called Cold Creek Basin, an area that doesn't see much tourist traffic. It's not a bad place: dense pine forests, steep ridges, a few small lakes, and miles of isolated terrain. But that assignment changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It started during late October, when most visitors were already gone for the season. The air was sharp and dry, the nights dropping below freezing. My task that week was to check on some old backcountry campsites and make sure the bear boxes were emptied and locked for winter. It was a 2-day trip, mostly uneventful, until I reached the upper part of the basin. There's an unmarked trail that cuts across an old fire road, barely visible anymore, covered in fallen needles and half-rotted branches. I followed it because I remembered there used to be a monitoring station out there, an old ranger cabin from decades ago that got decommissioned after a landslide blocked vehicle access. It wasn't officially part of my patrol area anymore, but I figured I'd check it out, maybe take some photos for the archives before the snow buried it for the season. The hike up took most of the afternoon. I passed through thick spruce stands, crossed a narrow stream twice, and climbed a steep section where the ground was loose and uneven. Everything was quiet. I didn't even hear birds, just the sound of my boots in the pine litter and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, it looked worse than I expected. The roof was sagging, one corner of the structure half sunk into the ground. The old tin chimney was rusted through, and part of the porch had collapsed. I walked around the outside first, checking for signs of animal nesting or recent human presence. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were boarded. I could smell old wood, mold, and something faintly metallic, like wet iron. Inside, the place was damp and cold. Dust and debris coated the floor, and the old bunk in the corner had collapsed under its own weight. The only thing that looked untouched was a small metal storage locker bolted to the wall. It was locked, but the latch was rusted through, so I pried it open with my multi-tool. Inside were some old ranger logs, a few field notebooks, and what looked like a broken radio. The papers were water-stained and brittle. I packed a few in a zip bag to take back for archiving. I spent about half an hour documenting the site before heading back down the hill. By then, the light was fading fast. The basin gets dark early that time of year, and I didn't want to hike in the dark, but I was still about 5 miles from my truck. The forest started to feel heavier as the temperature dropped. I could see my breath hanging in the air. Every sound seemed sharper, the crunch of leaves, the crack of distant branches. About halfway down, I noticed something odd near a clearing, a freshly dug patch of earth about the size of a small animal den, but too neat and square. The soil was dark and damp, and there were no tracks around it. It looked recent. I crouched beside it and saw what looked like the corner of an old tarp sticking out of the dirt. It wasn't deep, maybe a foot or so. I pulled the edge up and found a plastic storage tub half buried underneath. It was sealed tight with duct tape. At that point, my first thought was that it might have been an old research container or something someone stashed illegally. I didn't want to open it there since daylight was nearly gone, so I marked the spot with flagging tape and GPS coordinates to report it later. I hiked fast after that. The forest felt different, like it was closing in. The wind picked up through the trees, but it wasn't just wind I heard. There were short, sharp cracks, snapping twigs, shifting weight on the ground. I kept telling myself it was just deer or elk moving through, but it didn't sound right. The noises followed for a while, sometimes closer, sometimes farther off. When I stopped, they stopped too. I didn't look back, just focused on the trail ahead until I saw the beam of my truck's headlights reflecting off the trees. When I reached the ranger station that night, I logged everything, including the coordinates of the buried container. The next morning, I hiked back with another ranger named Mark. The sky was overcast, the air colder. When we reached the clearing, the flagged tree was still there, but the ground was different. The hole was filled back in. The soil was freshly packed again, smooth like someone had come during the night and buried it deeper. There were boot prints around it, maybe 2 or 3 different pairs. We dug for a while and eventually hit the edge of the tarp again, but the container was gone. Whoever came back must have taken it. The only thing left buried under the soil was a piece of old fabric and some rusted nails. It didn't make any sense. That spot was miles from any road or trailhead, and no one had any reason to be there. After that, things got strange for the rest of the season. We started finding small campsites deep in the backcountry. No permits, no records. Makeshift shelters, empty food cans, old fire rings. Sometimes there'd be signs someone left in a hurry. Half-burnt clothes, abandoned tools, footprints leading nowhere. But no one was ever found. The reports went up the chain, but nothing came of them. The park closed for winter a few weeks later, and the area was sealed off under snow. When spring came, I went back out there for the first patrol of the season. The snowmelt had washed a lot of things away, but I could still find the faint trace of that clearing. The ground was uneven, like something had been moved or dug up again. Near the tree line, I found a piece of blue duct tape half buried in the mud, the same kind that had sealed the container. I kept it as evidence, logged it, and hiked out. A few months later, a local hunter reported seeing a man living in a makeshift shelter near Cold Creek Basin. By the time rangers got there, the site was abandoned again, but they found a pile of burned papers, the same kind of field logs I'd taken from the old cabin. Someone had been going back there, taking the same things I had, maybe more. That was 3 years ago, and no one ever figured out who it was or what they were doing. The cabin eventually collapsed completely after a heavy snow year, and the park decided not to rebuild or investigate further. The area was marked as restricted due to unstable ground, and the trails leading up there were removed from the public maps. Every time I patrol near that ridge, I still think about that dug-up patch of earth and the sound of footsteps in the dark. I know someone was out there that night, someone watching, waiting for me to leave. Maybe they'd been living out there for years, hiding things in those woods. Maybe they still are. I never go back alone anymore. I had been working as a park ranger for 7 years when I got transferred to a new post deep inside northern Wyoming. The area wasn't popular with tourists. It was mostly rough forest, uneven hills, and long stretches of wetlands that made the ground soft even in dry months. The post itself was small, just a cabin with solar panels, a water tank, and a narrow dirt track that connected it to the highway about 10 miles away. My job was to monitor wildlife cameras, check the trails for fallen trees or erosion, and occasionally record signs of illegal hunting or trapping. Most days were quiet. I'd go out before sunrise, walk the routes, make notes, and return by mid-afternoon. It was in late October when things started to feel off. The season was cold that year. Frost came early and the air smelled heavy and damp. The forest was unusually quiet during my patrols. No birds, no distant woodpeckers, not even squirrels moving around. It was like the place was holding its breath. The camera logs also showed something strange. Weeks of missing footage from one of the remote cameras near the northern wetland. The batteries were fine and it hadn't been tampered with, but the files were corrupted in a way I hadn't seen before. I planned to check that camera myself the following week. The trail to the northern wetland wasn't easy. It wound through a mix of thick spruce and aspen, then dipped into a patch of soft mud and standing water that never seemed to dry out. I took my ATV as far as the ground would allow, then walked the rest of the way carrying my backpack, GPS, and a can of bear spray. The cold mist hung low, making the air feel heavier. The ground squelched under my boots, and each step left a deep print. When I reached the area where the camera was supposed to be, I noticed something unusual. The old animal path nearby looked freshly disturbed, as if something large had been moving through recently. The tracks were long, uneven, and didn't look like deer or elk. The camera pole was still standing, but the camera itself was gone. The mounting bracket had been bent downward, like someone had forced it off. I searched the area and found the camera about 15 feet away, half buried in mud. The lens was cracked, and the back cover was open. I assumed a bear might have messed with it. I wrapped it up in a cloth and decided to head back before the fog thickened. But on my way out, I noticed another thing that didn't sit right. A strong smell of decay, sharp and sickly, coming from somewhere behind the ridge. At first, I thought it might be a dead deer, or maybe an old carcass that got dragged into the wetland. I followed the smell slowly, moving around a cluster of low shrubs until I came across it. It wasn't an animal. It was a pile of bones, some old, some fresh, stacked loosely in the mud. They were cleanly cut, not chewed. Nearby, there was the rusted frame of what looked like an old metal trap, but much larger than any legal one I'd seen. I crouched down to look closer and saw tufts of hair stuck in the mud, brownish, maybe from a bear or moose, but it looked wrong. There was something almost human about the shape of the rib bones at the top of the pile. My stomach tightened. I took a few photos and marked the spot on my GPS. On the way back, I felt watched. I don't mean that in a dramatic way, just a quiet, pressing feeling that someone was nearby. Every sound felt closer. Every broken branch or shifting leaf made me stop and look around. When I finally reached the ATV, I realized I hadn't eaten all day, and my hands were shaking from the cold. I drove back to the cabin, filed my report, and decided to hike back with another ranger the next morning to confirm what I'd found. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was strong enough to make the cabin walls creak. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit up, metal scraping against metal. It was faint but distinct, like something brushing against the storage shed out back. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The shed door was slightly open, even though I'd locked it earlier. I checked inside. The smell of gasoline was strong. A few tools were scattered on the ground, and a small roll of wire was missing. There were boot prints in the dirt leading toward the woods. I followed them with my light until they disappeared into the dark. I didn't see anyone. The next morning, the other ranger, Mark, showed up. We hiked together to the site, but when we got there, the pile of bones was gone. The mud was freshly disturbed, and the area smelled faintly of bleach or some kind of cleaner. All that remained was a shallow pit filled with cloudy water. I showed him the GPS coordinates and the photos, but he looked skeptical. He said maybe I mixed up the location or stumbled upon an old hunter's dump site that got washed out overnight. But the ground hadn't rained, and I knew exactly where I'd been. That week, more things went missing around the post. Trail markers, wire, an old map from the storage wall. The same camera that had been broken showed up again at the cabin doorstep one morning, cleaned and reassembled, with a new memory card inside. I didn't touch it. I sent it to headquarters with a note explaining everything. They didn't respond for several days. When they finally did, they said the footage was blank. By the second week of November, the first snow came. I was preparing to rotate out for the winter when I got a call from a district supervisor. They told me law enforcement had found a camp hidden about 3 miles from my area, deep in the woods, near an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. It was filled with traps, knives, animal bones, and what looked like human remains. Whoever had been staying there was gone. There was no sign of when they left, but the investigators believed they'd been living out there for years, maybe even a decade. I realized then that what I'd found wasn't random. Someone had been watching the park for a long time. They'd been collecting bones, building traps, and possibly living off the land. When I stumbled across that site, I must have disturbed their work. They had come back that night to retrieve what they'd left behind, to erase what I'd seen. Even after the investigation, nothing was ever confirmed. They never caught anyone. They said it was probably a poacher or someone living illegally off the grid. But deep down I knew it wasn't just a poacher. Whoever it was knew how to move without being seen, how to clean an area without leaving much trace. When I left that post for good, I stopped once on the dirt road that led out. The fog was thick again, the same way it had been that first day. I looked out over the wetlands, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement near the tree line. Something crouched low, still as stone. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I've worked at other parks since then, but I've never felt the same peace I used to feel in the woods. Every time I see a missing camera, a disturbed patch of ground, or smell decay in the cold air, I remember that pile of bones and the feeling of being watched in the silence. Some things out there aren't supernatural, they're just human, and that makes them worse. I've worked as a park ranger in different areas across the Pacific Northwest, but the assignment I had at Twin Pines Reserve was the one that stuck with me the most. It wasn't a big park, just a stretch of forest, a lake, and a few miles of backcountry trails that weren't well maintained. It was quiet there, too quiet, honestly. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how far you are from everything. When I first arrived, the supervisor told me my main tasks were trail checks, maintenance, and keeping an eye out for illegal hunting or dumping. Nothing out of the ordinary. The area had some steep terrain, small caves, and a few old logging roads that weren't even on the official maps anymore. The older rangers said the park used to be private land owned by a timber company, but it was abandoned after the 80s when operations stopped. They said there were still pieces of old machinery buried in the brush, and sometimes you'd find them by accident when clearing a trail or following animal paths. My shift rotated between day and night patrols. During the nights, I'd drive the gravel roads that wound through the forest and check the campsites, then park near the main lookout tower to monitor for lights or movement in the woods. Most nights were uneventful, but one week in early September changed that. It had been raining for days, heavy at times, and the low-lying areas near the lake flooded badly. A few smaller trails were closed off, and I was assigned to check one of the higher elevation loops, an old maintenance route that hadn't been used much since the 90s. It started near the ranger station and wound uphill through thick cedar stands before looping back around near a ridge line that overlooked the water. The plan was simple: hike the loop, make sure there were no washouts or fallen trees blocking it, and head back before dusk. The forest was damp and smelled of wet earth and rot. The air was heavy with mist, and every step I took made a soft sucking sound in the mud. My uniform pants were soaked halfway up by the time I reached the old part of the trail. It was narrower there, less traveled, with roots pushing up through the ground and moss hanging off every branch. I found a few deer tracks, some raccoon prints, and once or twice what looked like boot impressions, though faint and filled with water. I noted them, figuring maybe some hunter had come through before the rain started. Around 2 miles in, the trail bent uphill and passed through an area that looked like it had been cleared decades ago. The stumps were gray and rotted, ferns growing in the middle of them. I spotted something that caught my eye, a patch of open ground ahead that looked unnatural, like it had been dug recently. When I got closer, I realized it was an old logging trench, maybe 20 feet long, filled halfway with rainwater. The soil around it was freshly disturbed, darker than the surrounding dirt. It didn't look new, but it didn't look decades old either. Beside it, there were pieces of old metal, maybe parts of a winch or an axle, rusted nearly to dust. I thought maybe the rain had eroded some of the hillside and exposed the old equipment. Still, something about the shape of that trench bothered me. It wasn't the even cut of a machine trench. It looked more like it had been hand-dug at some point. I marked the location on my GPS and moved on. About another half-mile ahead, the forest grew denser and the fog thicker. My radio kept cutting out, normal in that area, but still frustrating. I was trying to finish the loop before it got too dark, but I noticed more of those faint boot prints again. This time they were clearer, leading off the trail toward a slope. The tread was deep and wide, like a work boot. My first thought was that maybe one of the local poachers had been using the trail. We had issues before with guys sneaking in to set illegal traps. I followed the tracks down the slope maybe 100 feet until I saw something that made me stop. In the mud near a fallen tree were drag marks, long, heavy ones. Whatever had been pulled through there left deep grooves that went downhill toward another patch of disturbed earth. My stomach tightened a bit when I saw the shape. It was another trench, smaller than the first and partially filled with water. The smell hit me next. Mud mixed with something sour and organic, faint but distinct. I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the shallow pool. The surface rippled from the light rain, and at first I thought it was just dark soil. Then I saw a patch of pale fabric, maybe canvas or clothing, caught under a branch. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but every instinct I had told me to step back. I marked the coordinates again, took a few photos, and decided to radio it in as soon as I got a signal. As I started back toward the trail, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The sound of birds had stopped completely, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I turned once to check behind me, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shape through the fog. Not an animal, taller, upright, but by the time I blinked, it was gone. I stood still for a full minute, scanning, trying to tell if it was just a trick of the mist or something else. Then I heard a faint crunch from the direction of the trench. I didn't wait to find out. I started walking fast back toward the main trail. My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every few steps I'd glance over my shoulder, seeing nothing but fog and trees. The rain started to come down harder, washing away whatever prints I'd left. By the time I made it back to where the trail widened again, I finally got radio signal. I called it in as a potential burial site, gave the coordinates, and was told to wait at the trailhead for local authorities. When they got there an hour later, I was soaked and shaking from the cold. They went back in with me, this time with deputies and forensic techs. When we reached the trench, the rain had filled it almost completely. They had to pump the water out before they could see what was underneath. What they found were remains. 2 of them. Both adults, both estimated to have been buried there less than a year before. They were wrapped in old canvas tarps and tied with rope. The disturbed trench I saw earlier up the hill turned out to be another burial site that had been partially washed out by rain. The following days were a blur of questioning and reports. They said the investigation led them to a man who had been squatting in the backwoods cabins left from the old logging company. He was arrested a week later after someone found his camp not far from the ridge. They said he'd been living there for months, moving through the forest at night, using the forgotten logging roads to stay hidden. The victims were people who had gone missing from nearby counties. Hikers, drifters, one fisherman. For weeks after, I couldn't stop replaying that day. The smell, the drag marks, the moment I thought I saw someone standing in the fog. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't something supernatural. It was worse because it was real. That forest had been someone's hunting ground, and I had walked right through the middle of it alone. Even now, years later, every time I'm deep in the woods and the fog starts to roll in, I still think about Twin Pines, about how easy it is for people to disappear out there, about how silence in the forest isn't peace. It's a warning. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in the northern part of Montana, assigned to a large area that bordered the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The park stretched across rough terrain, dense pine forests, sharp ridgelines, and long stretches of old fire roads that hadn't been maintained in years. My main job that summer was trail inspection and backcountry maintenance, which meant I spent a lot of time alone, hiking miles of remote trails to check signs, clear fallen trees, and report damage to bridges and campgrounds. Most of the time it was peaceful. I liked the quiet, the smell of the trees, and the slow rhythm of days where I only saw wildlife and heard the wind moving through the forest. But by the end of that season, I came to understand how isolation can twist something that once felt peaceful into something deeply unsettling. It started in late July. We'd had a series of strong storms roll through, heavy rain that caused several washouts and landslides across the park. One section in particular, called Ridgeview Loop, had been closed off due to reports of an unstable slope. I was told to hike out, assess the area, and make notes for the crews that would come later to do the repairs. Ridgeview wasn't an easy trail. It was narrow, steep, and cut along the edge of a long ravine that dropped into a tangle of deadfall and rock. It was also far from the main camp, almost 10 miles out by dirt road and then another 8 by trail. I packed my gear, including a radio, GPS, a small first aid kit, and a tent in case I had to stay overnight. The day I started, the air felt heavy. The forest was damp and quiet in that strange way it gets after rain, when everything seems to be holding its breath. My boots sank into the soft ground and water dripped from branches overhead. The first few miles were easy. Clear signs, a few downed limbs, nothing serious. But as I got closer to the ridge, I noticed small signs that something had been moving through the area recently. The mud along the trail had deep tracks, boot prints, maybe a few days old. They didn't look like hiker prints, though. They were uneven, almost dragging in spots, as if whoever made them was carrying something heavy or struggling to walk. I followed them without thinking much about it. The tracks continued along the same path I was supposed to take anyway. As I moved higher, the trees thinned and the air cooled. The slope on my left rose sharply, and on my right the ground dropped off steeply into the ravine. It was one of those trails where you have to stay focused because a single misplaced step could send you tumbling. After about an hour, I reached the section that had supposedly washed out. A large portion of the trail was gone, collapsed into the ravine below. The soil was soft and cracked, with roots and stones sticking out at odd angles. I marked the area with flagging tape and took a few photos. That part of the job was routine. But when I stepped back to review the damage, I noticed something strange about the slope below. There was a tarp caught in the branches of a fallen tree about 30 feet down. It looked like a camping tarp, dark green, torn at one edge. I climbed down carefully, using the roots for balance, and when I reached it, I saw that it was part of a small makeshift camp. A single-person tent lay collapsed under the tarp, half buried in mud and leaves. A rusted stove, a crushed water bottle, and a sleeping bag soaked through with rain sat nearby. It looked like it had been there for months. Normally we'd find old camps like that from hunters or vagrants passing through, but something about this one felt off. The tent flap was torn, and inside was a pile of personal gear, boots, a jacket, a notebook, but no sign of the person who'd used them. I pulled the notebook out carefully. Most of the pages were ruined by water, but a few were legible. There were notes about fishing spots, dates, and weather entries that stopped abruptly after mid-May. That was almost 2 months earlier. I took a few photos, noted the location, and packed the book in a plastic bag for evidence. By that time, the light had started to fade, and I realized I wouldn't make it back before dark. I found a small clearing uphill and set up camp. That night, the woods felt heavier than usual. There was no wind, no insects, just the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. I lay in my tent, unable to sleep, feeling a strange unease that I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, just an awareness that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to believe. Around midnight I heard movement, a soft thud of something stepping on wet ground. It was slow, deliberate, not the quick rustle of a deer. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved closer, stopped, then shifted away again. I didn't go outside. I told myself it was probably a bear or an elk, something passing through. But I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning I found new prints near my tent. Not animal prints, boot prints, fresh ones, deeper than the ones I'd seen before. They circled around my tent once, and then disappeared into the trees downhill toward the old camp. I followed them for a short distance before losing them in the mud. I remember standing there, staring into the woods, feeling that same heavy silence pressing around me. When I hiked back to base later that day, I turned in my report, photos, and the notebook. A week later, law enforcement came out and confirmed that the gear I found likely belonged to a missing hiker who'd vanished earlier that spring. They said the body hadn't been found yet, but they'd keep searching the area. I figured that was the end of it. But a few days later, I was assigned back to Ridgeview for boundary checks. I didn't want to go, but it was my job. When I returned, something had changed. The collapsed tent and gear were gone. Every trace of the campsite had been cleared out, except for the faint marks in the mud where it had been. I thought maybe the investigators had taken everything for evidence, but when I asked about it later, they said they hadn't been back yet. They hadn't removed anything. I went back out again the following week, this time with another ranger. The washout looked worse, the ground more unstable. We flagged it off and set up barriers to prevent hikers from wandering through. As we worked, I looked down the ravine again. For a moment I thought I saw something among the trees below, a shape, faint and still, half hidden by brush. But when I blinked, it was gone. We didn't investigate. The slope was too dangerous. At the end of the season, I left Montana and took another assignment in Idaho. Months later, I heard through another ranger that the missing hiker's remains had finally been found a mile downstream from that ridge, partially buried in a shallow wash. They said it looked like he'd fallen during one of the early spring storms and broken his leg. He probably couldn't climb out and died there from exposure. The coroner estimated the time of death around mid-May, the same date as the last entry in that notebook. I still think about those footprints that circled my tent, the ones that hadn't been there the night before. Maybe someone else had stumbled onto that area, or maybe I just misjudged what I saw in the mud. But the feeling I had that night, the sense of being watched, the slow steps outside the tent, still sits in the back of my mind. I tell myself it was just an animal or my nerves playing tricks. But sometimes when I think about that empty campsite and how it vanished overnight, I can't help but picture that ridge, the soft mud, and the way those boot prints seemed to drag, like someone struggling to walk, after that season. I stopped working deep backcountry assignments alone. I still love the woods, but there's a kind of silence out there that doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it feels like the forest keeps its own kind of memory, of the people who got lost, the ones who never made it back, and the ones who, for a night or two, unknowingly camped just a few yards from where they took their last breath. I worked as a park ranger in northern Montana for almost 6 years. Most of my time was spent in a remote section of the park, a huge stretch of land full of steep valleys, thick pine forest, and quiet lakes that didn't see many visitors except during the summer. It was a lonely area, but I liked that. I preferred the quiet, the long hikes, the sound of wind moving through the trees. It made me feel like the world still had pieces left untouched. This story happened during late September, when the air had started to turn cold and the tourists were mostly gone. That time of year was when we did the closing tasks, checking the trails, removing temporary signs, and making sure no campsites were left dirty or open. It was simple, repetitive work, but it took me deep into places most people never bothered to see. That day, I was checking a backcountry loop called Cedar Hollow Trail. It wasn't a long hike, maybe 12 miles, but the terrain made it tiring. The path followed a small creek through dense pine, then climbed up a ridge where you could see the valley below. The last time I had been out there was in June, and I remembered one of the old bridges being a little unstable. I brought a toolkit, some replacement boards, a small pack, and my radio. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped and the sky was gray. There was a faint smell of snow in the air, though it was too early in the season for it. The forest was completely quiet. No wind, no birds, just that thick, heavy silence that makes you aware of every movement you make. My boots crunched against the damp pine needles as I made my way up the trail. I stopped a few times to mark fallen branches and take notes about trail conditions. Everything seemed normal until I reached a section about 6 miles in, where the creek ran down into a narrow gorge. There was a small clearing there, a good place to rest. But what caught my attention was the ground. The soil looked disturbed, like something had been dug up. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been there, maybe a bear digging for roots, but it was too neat for that. The earth was in piles, almost in a line, and beside one of them was a shovel. Not a ranger shovel, but an old rusted one with a wooden handle. It looked like it had been left there for a while. I knelt down and brushed some dirt away. Underneath the soil, there was a piece of torn tarp, stained dark brown. The smell that came out when I lifted the corner hit me so fast I gagged. It was that sickly sweet, unmistakable smell of rot. I dropped the tarp and stepped back, covering my mouth. I knew what that smell meant. I didn't touch it again. I forced myself to calm down, took a few steps back, and radioed in. But the radio only gave static. That wasn't unusual out there. The ridge blocked most signals. I decided I'd go up the trail another mile or two until I got a better signal, then report it. I marked the spot with flagging tape and started walking. As I went up, I kept thinking about it. It could have been an animal carcass, sure. Maybe someone buried a deer or livestock. But the tarp didn't make sense, and neither did the shovel. There were no cabins nearby, and no logging work in that area for years. The higher I went, the more I started noticing other things. There were fresh boot prints along the edge of the trail, big ones like a man's. I hadn't seen any vehicles at the trailhead, so whoever it was had walked in. The prints weren't old either. The rain from the day before hadn't washed them away, which meant they were made after the storm. When I finally reached the ridge, I could see the valley below and part of the creek winding through it. I stopped there to catch my breath and tried the radio again. This time it worked, but just barely. I managed to get a message through to base, telling them about the shovel, the disturbed ground, and the possible body. They told me to stay put and wait until they could send someone from the main station. That meant at least 2 or 3 hours. It started getting dark faster than I expected. The clouds had thickened, and the light turned gray-blue. I decided to move back down to where I'd found the tarp, so I could guide the others when they arrived. I took my time going down, scanning the woods on both sides. The forest was too quiet. I hadn't seen or heard a single animal all day, not even birds. When I got back to the clearing, I noticed right away that something was wrong. The shovel was gone. The tarp was gone too. The ground was smoothed over, like someone had come and filled it all in. The flagging tape I'd tied to the branch was still there, but everything else was different. The piles of soil were leveled out, and the spot looked like it had never been touched. I stood there frozen. I felt that cold, hollow feeling crawl through me. I checked my watch. It had only been maybe an hour and a half since I left that spot. There was no way an animal could have done that. Someone had been there. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The forest was dense and dark, the air still and heavy. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it, that sense of being watched. My heartbeat got so loud I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to call on the radio again, but I knew yelling into it would just make noise and echo through the valley. I started backing away, slow and quiet, keeping my eyes on the tree line. My mind kept trying to find an explanation, maybe a poacher, maybe someone hiding something, but it didn't matter. Whoever it was had come back, and they didn't want that spot to be found. As I moved up the trail again, I caught sight of something hanging on a low branch. It was the same torn piece of tarp I'd lifted earlier, tied into a knot like someone had hung it there on purpose. It was dripping wet like it had just been washed in the creek. That's when I stopped walking altogether. I didn't need to see anything else. I turned and went straight back the way I came, not running, just moving fast and steady until I reached the trailhead. By the time I got to my truck, it was almost dark. I locked the doors, turned the key, and didn't look in the mirror until I was halfway down the service road. The entire drive back to the station, I kept checking the rear view, half expecting headlights or a figure in the road, but there was nothing. When I got back, I reported everything exactly as it happened. They sent a small team out the next morning, but they said they didn't find anything. No shovel, no tarp, no disturbed soil, no footprints. The clearing looked untouched. They told me I might have mistaken animal digging or old trash, but I know what I saw. I still remember that smell, thick and sour in the cold air. A few weeks later, the first snow came and covered everything. I never went back to Cedar Hollow Trail after that. They reassigned me to a different sector the next spring, closer to the station. Every once in a while, when the wind is quiet and the woods feel too still, I think about that spot and the way the ground looked after it had been filled back in. Whatever was buried there, whoever came back to hide it again, they were watching me that day. I'm sure of it. I've been a park ranger for 12 years, mostly stationed in large wooded areas of the Pacific Northwest. The park I was assigned to last summer, though, was different. It wasn't one of those big famous parks with wide trails and heavy foot traffic. It was a smaller, lesser-known section of federal land, hundreds of acres of dense forest with steep ravines, old logging roads, and half-collapsed hunting cabins from decades ago. The land sat between two larger protected areas, used mostly as a buffer zone, but the department wanted regular monitoring done there because people had been ignoring the no camping signs. They wanted someone to hike the main drainage every few days, note down any illegal fires, dumped trash, or poaching signs. That became my assignment in mid-June. It was the kind of job you mostly did alone. The trails were rough, barely visible in some places. I'd take a radio, GPS, and a pack with enough supplies for a full day. Most of the time, I'd drive my truck up to the old service gate, lock it behind me, then hike in for miles following a dry creek bed that eventually met a small river. It was quiet out there, too quiet sometimes. The air was heavy with the smell of pine needles and wet soil, and you could hear your own footsteps echo off the trees. There were no human sounds. No traffic, no voices, just the constant hum of insects and the occasional woodpecker tapping at a tree. The first few weeks were uneventful. I found a few illegal fire rings and some beer cans near the river, and I marked them down for cleanup. Nothing unusual. But around early July, I started finding signs that someone was living out there. Not camping for a night or two, actually living there. It started with what looked like a small fire pit covered in fresh ash, surrounded by neatly stacked stones. Nearby, I found a pile of wood that had been chopped clean, not like the random sticks campers usually use. A few days later, higher up in the hills, I came across a tarp strung between trees with a pile of empty food cans underneath it. The labels were torn off, but the cans looked clean, almost washed. Whoever was out there wasn't just surviving. They were maintaining things. The weird part was how hidden everything was. Whoever it was knew how to blend in. From a few steps away, the tarp was invisible under the tree canopy. The fire pits were always cold when I found them, and there were no footprints leading in or out, at least none clear enough to follow. By the third week, I was making more detailed notes, taking photos, and reporting it back to my supervisor. He told me to keep documenting it, said it was probably a long-term squatter. That happened sometimes, but it still didn't feel right. This area was miles from the nearest road and rough terrain the whole way. Even hauling in food and supplies would be a nightmare. One morning in late July, I started earlier than usual. I wanted to make it farther into the northern section, where the terrain was steeper and less explored. I followed an old logging road that eventually narrowed into a single overgrown path. Around noon, I came to a clearing that didn't show up on the map. It was maybe 40 yards wide, bordered by thick cedar trees. In the middle of it stood a small wooden structure, more like a shack. It looked old but not abandoned. The walls were patched with sheets of tin and the roof was intact. There was a crude door made of planks tied together with wire. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. No sound but the faint wind and the buzz of flies. I walked closer, keeping my distance from the entrance. There was no lock, no sign of movement, but what caught my attention were the objects hanging from a nearby tree branch. There were old tools, an axe head without a handle, a rusted handsaw, a bundle of wire, all tied up with thin cord and dangling at different lengths. Below them was a small pile of animal bones arranged neatly in a circle. It wasn't something I'd seen before. Not the kind of thing hunters or squatters usually did. I took some pictures and wrote down the coordinates. When I looked through one of the side cracks in the wall, I saw something inside that made me step back. There were shelves lining the interior, made from rough-cut wood filled with jars. Mason jars, hundreds of them, all filled with murky brown liquid. Some had labels written in marker, dates mostly. Others were unlabeled, but had what looked like bits of meat floating inside. The air around the shack smelled faintly sour, like decay. I didn't go inside. I didn't have a reason to, officially. I just backed away and started heading back toward the service gate. The rest of the hike, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no clear sign of who was using that place, but the way it was hidden, the care that went into it, it wasn't someone passing through. When I filed my report, I made sure to include the photos and GPS point. My supervisor said he'd forward it to law enforcement, but I didn't hear anything after that. For a few days, I avoided that section, sticking to the lower trails and focusing on other parts of the park. Then one morning, About a week later, I was driving up to the gate when I noticed something odd. The chain on the service gate was hanging loose. It wasn't cut or broken, just unlatched. I always locked it when I left. Always. I parked, got out, and checked the lock. It was mine, the same one, but it wasn't actually locked through the chain. It was just looped and hanging there. The gate itself was slightly open, maybe a foot wide. I closed it properly and latched it tight, but that whole day I couldn't focus. I kept glancing around while walking the trails. Around mid-afternoon, I started hearing faint metallic clanging echoing from up in the hills. It was distant, rhythmic, like someone hitting metal with a hammer. It would start for a few minutes, stop, then start again. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to come from near that same clearing where the shack was. By the time I reached that area again, the sound had stopped. The clearing looked the same at first, but when I got closer, I realized the hanging tools were gone. The tree branch was empty. The small pile of bones had been replaced with fresh ones, larger, darker, and still streaked with red. That was enough for me. I took a few more pictures and hiked back out. I sent everything to my supervisor that night and told him flat out that I wasn't going back in until someone else checked it out. 2 days later, I got a call saying the sheriff's department had gone in with a small team. When they reached the coordinates, the shack was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, just gone. No trace of the tin, the shelves, or the jars. The ground where it stood was flattened like something had been dragged across it. They even brought dogs, but they didn't find anything, not even a trail. After that, the department stopped assigning anyone to that area. They said it wasn't worth the effort and that the land might be closed off completely. That was months ago. I still think about that shack every time I drive past that section of forest. I've worked in a lot of remote places, seen all kinds of strange things people do out in the woods. Illegal stills, meth labs, survivalist camps. But nothing has ever felt like that. The silence, the organization, the sense that someone had been watching me the whole time. Sometimes when I'm out alone, I still hear that faint sound of metal striking metal coming from somewhere deep in the hills. It never lasts long, just enough to remind me that someone or something human still lives out there, moving through those woods, staying one step ahead of everyone who tries to find them. I've worked as a park ranger for over 10 years now, and most of my shifts have been routine. Checking campsites, closing trails during bad weather, watching for illegal hunters or vandals. It's a quiet job most of the time. The thing about working in remote places, though, is that you spend so much time alone that when something does happen, it tends to stick with you for a long time. What happened that summer still crosses my mind every time I drive through that section of forest. Even though I've told myself 1,000 times it was just bad luck and human error, still, the memory of it makes my stomach feel tight every time I think about it. It was late July, and the heat had been brutal for days. The park I worked in sat deep in the northern Rockies, thick with pine and spruce, and crossed by old logging roads that were slowly being reclaimed by nature. A small group of volunteers had been helping restore a backcountry trail that followed an old river corridor, and part of my job that week was to check on their progress and make sure the area was safe. A few days before, one of them mentioned hearing something like distant explosions echoing through the hills. We'd assumed it was someone target shooting or blasting for a nearby mine, but I still made a note to look around. That morning, I started out from the ranger station around 6 a.m. The air was cool but heavy with humidity. I loaded up the ATV with water, first aid, and some basic tools. It was about a 2-hour ride along the service roads to reach the site. Most of the trail was shaded, but I could tell it would get brutally hot later. The forest was dense, quiet except for insects and the occasional crack of a branch. Around halfway there, I came across a narrow dirt turnoff I didn't recognize. It looked freshly used, with tire ruts pressed into the mud from recent rain. I slowed down and looked closer. There were footprints, too, boot prints, heading in and out of the tree line. I didn't want to assume anything, but unauthorized vehicles weren't allowed this deep in the park. I marked the spot with my GPS and continued on. making a note to check it again later. When I reached the work site, the volunteers were gone. They usually hiked out around noon, but it wasn't even 9 a.m. yet. Their tools were stacked under a tarp, and their tent was gone. That struck me as odd. I figured maybe they'd left early because of the heat, though no one had radioed in. I followed the river upstream, tracing the sound of running water until I came to a small clearing. That's when I found the first strange thing, a pile of old metal debris beside the stream. Rusted barrels, bent sheet metal, and broken glass bottles scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had been dumping junk here for years, maybe remnants from old logging days. But the thing that really caught my attention was a small pit beside it. It wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet, but it had been dug recently. The dirt was loose and still damp underneath. There were tire tracks near it too. I crouched down and noticed something metallic sticking out of the dirt. It was a crushed fuel canister, old and rusted through. The smell coming from the pit made me recoil, a sharp chemical odor that burned my throat. It reminded me of diesel mixed with rot. I stepped back and jotted down a note to report it to environmental safety. As I turned to head back, I saw movement across the stream, just a flicker, like someone ducking behind a tree. I called out but got no answer. I stood still for a minute, trying to listen. The forest was completely silent now, not even birds. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how far away from everything you really are. I stayed there for a bit, watching, then decided to circle back to the ATV. When I reached the spot, I noticed fresh mud splashed on the side of it, mud that hadn't been there earlier. There were boot prints leading away from it, heading in the same direction as that strange side road I'd passed on the way in. By this point, I had that uneasy feeling creeping up, the kind that doesn't come from fear exactly, but from knowing something's not right. I followed the prints for about half a mile before I found where they stopped. They ended at the edge of a small open area filled with more junk, old machinery, scrap metal, car parts. It looked like someone had been illegally dumping here for years, but there was also a smell that made me stop cold. It was strong, like burnt rubber mixed with meat. There was a shallow depression near the center, blackened with ash. Around it were several burned pieces of what looked like clothing, some melted plastic, and a few metal tools half buried in the dirt. I knelt down and saw what looked like bone fragments mixed in with the ash. I didn't touch anything. My first thought was that it was an animal carcass someone burned to get rid of. But there were scraps of fabric with it, fabric that looked like the same work shirts our volunteers wore. I backed away slowly and checked my radio. The signal was weak but usable, so I called in a possible illegal dump site and requested an investigation team. The response was delayed and crackly, but they said they'd send a crew. I waited by the ATV for nearly 2 hours. Nobody showed. It was mid-afternoon when I finally decided to head back toward the main service road to meet them halfway. As I drove out, I noticed fresh tracks again, leading down that same narrow turnoff I'd seen that morning. This time I followed it all the way. The road curved through thick brush and ended at an old cabin, half collapsed and hidden by pines. It wasn't on any of our maps. There were empty oil drums stacked beside it, and a faded "No Trespassing" sign nailed to a tree. I got off the ATV and walked around. The cabin door was open. Inside were piles of rusted tools, old cans, and a filthy mattress. But what caught my eye were several empty barrels labeled with hazardous waste markings. They'd been stripped of serial numbers. Someone had been using this place to dump chemical waste for a long time, probably years. The burned pit back near the stream suddenly made sense. Whoever was running this operation was burning evidence, maybe even people who stumbled onto it. I left immediately, rode straight back to the ranger station, and filed a full report. Within 2 days, state investigators were all over the site. They found several burn pits, dozens of buried barrels leaking into the soil, and evidence that at least one person had been killed there. The volunteers I'd been looking for were eventually found miles away. Their car had broken down, and they'd hiked out safely. But the man responsible for the dumping was never caught. The investigation dragged on for months, and eventually, the area was sealed off completely for cleanup. I was reassigned to another district. Every now and then, I still get updates from friends who work in that region. They say nothing grows near the stream anymore. The ground stays oily and animals avoid it. I sometimes think about that moment I first smelled the chemical stench, and how easily I could have walked right into that pit without realizing what was there. It wasn't ghosts or monsters hiding in that forest. It was something worse. It was just a man who thought he could bury his crimes where no one would ever look. I've been a park ranger for 12 years, mostly stationed in large, wooded areas of the Pacific Northwest. The park I was assigned to last summer, though, was different. It wasn't one of those big, famous parks with wide trails and heavy foot traffic. It was a smaller, lesser-known section of federal land, hundreds of acres of dense forest with steep ravines, old logging roads, and half-collapsed hunting cabins from decades ago. The land sat between two larger protected areas, used mostly as a buffer zone, but the department wanted regular monitoring done there because people had been ignoring the no camping signs. They wanted someone to hike the main drainage every few days, note down any illegal fires, dump trash or poaching signs. That became my assignment in mid-June. It was the kind of job you mostly did alone. The trails were rough, barely visible in some places. I'd take a radio, GPS, and a pack with enough supplies for a full day. Most of the time, I'd drive my truck up to the old service gate, lock it behind me, then hike in for miles following a dry creek bed that eventually met a small river. It was quiet out there, too quiet sometimes. The air was heavy with the smell of pine needles and wet soil, and you could hear your own footsteps echo off the trees. There were no human sounds. No traffic, no voices, just the constant hum of insects and the occasional woodpecker tapping at a tree. The first few weeks were uneventful. I found a few illegal fire rings and some beer cans near the river, and I marked them down for cleanup. Nothing unusual, but around early July I started finding signs that someone was living out there. Not camping for a night or two, actually living there. It started with what looked like a small fire pit covered in fresh ash, surrounded by neatly stacked stones. Nearby, I found a pile of wood that had been chopped clean, not like the random sticks campers usually use. A few days later, higher up in the hills, I came across a tarp strung between trees with a pile of empty food cans underneath it. The labels were torn off, but the cans looked clean, almost washed. Whoever was out there wasn't just surviving. They were maintaining things. The weird part was how hidden everything was. Whoever it was knew how to blend in. From a few steps away, the tarp was invisible under the tree canopy. The fire pits were always cold when I found them, and there were no footprints leading in or out. At least none clear enough to follow. By the third week, I was making more detailed notes, taking photos, and reporting it back to my supervisor. He told me to keep documenting it, said it was probably a long-term squatter. That happened sometimes, but it still didn't feel right. This area was miles from the nearest road and rough terrain the whole way. Even hauling in food and supplies would be a nightmare. One morning in late July, I started earlier than usual. I wanted to make it farther into the northern section where the terrain was steeper and less explored. I followed an old logging road that eventually narrowed into a single overgrown path. Around noon, I came to a clearing that didn't show up on the map. It was maybe 40 yards wide, bordered by thick cedar trees. In the middle of it stood a small wooden structure, more like a shack. It looked old but not abandoned. The walls were patched with sheets of tin, and the roof was intact. There was a crude door made of planks tied together with wire. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. No sound but the faint wind and the buzz of flies. I walked closer, keeping my distance from the entrance. There was no lock, no sign of movement, but what caught my attention were the objects hanging from a nearby tree branch. There were old tools, an axe head without a handle, a rusted handsaw, a bundle of wire, all tied up with thin cord and dangling at different lengths. Below them was a small pile of animal bones arranged neatly in a circle. It wasn't something I'd seen before. Not the kind of thing hunters or squatters usually did. I took some pictures and wrote down the coordinates. When I looked through one of the side cracks in the wall, I saw something inside that made me step back. There were shelves lining the interior, made from rough-cut wood filled with jars. Mason jars, hundreds of them, all filled with murky brown liquid. Some had labels written in marker, dates mostly. Others were unlabeled but had what looked like bits of meat floating inside. The air around the shack smelled faintly sour, like decay. I didn't go inside. I didn't have a reason to, officially. I just backed away and started heading back toward the service gate. The rest of the hike, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no clear sign of who was using that place, but the way it was hidden, the care that went into it. It wasn't someone passing through. When I filed my report, I made sure to include the photos and GPS point. My supervisor said he'd forward it to law enforcement, but I didn't hear anything after that. For a few days, I avoided that section, sticking to the lower trails and focusing on other parts of the park. Then one morning, about a week later, I was driving up to the gate when I noticed something odd. The chain on the service gate was hanging loose. It wasn't cut or broken, just unlatched. I always locked it when I left, always. I parked, got out, and checked the lock. It was mine, the same one, but it wasn't actually locked through the chain. It was just looped and hanging there. The gate itself was slightly open, maybe a foot wide. I closed it properly and latched it tight, but that whole day I couldn't focus. I kept glancing around while walking the trails. Around mid-afternoon, I started hearing faint metallic clanging echoing from up in the hills. It was distant, rhythmic, like someone hitting metal with a hammer. It would start for a few minutes, stop, then start again. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to come from near that same clearing where the shack was. By the time I reached that area again, the sound had stopped. The clearing looked the same at first, but when I got closer, I realized the hanging tools were gone. The tree branch was empty. The small pile of bones had been replaced with fresh ones, larger, darker, and still streaked with red. That was enough for me. I took a few more pictures and hiked back out. I sent everything to my supervisor that night and told him flat out that I wasn't going back in until someone else checked it out. 2 days later, I got a call saying the sheriff's department had gone in with a small team. When they reached the coordinates, the shack was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, just gone. No trace of the tin, the shelves, or the jars. The ground where it stood was flattened like something had been dragged across it. They even brought dogs, but they didn't find anything, not even a trail. After that, the department stopped assigning anyone to that area. They said it wasn't worth the effort and that the land might be closed off completely. That was months ago. I still think about that shack every time I drive past that section of forest. I've worked in a lot of remote places, seen all kinds of strange things people do out in the woods, illegal stills, meth labs, survivalist camps, but nothing has ever felt like that. The silence, the organization, the sense that someone had been watching me the whole time. Sometimes when I'm out alone, I still hear that faint sound of metal striking metal coming from somewhere deep in the hills. It never lasts long, just enough to remind me that someone, or something human, still lives out there, moving through those woods, staying one step ahead of everyone who tries to find them. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana for 4 summers in a row. The park I was assigned to wasn't one of the famous ones people travel across the country to see. It was smaller, mostly forest and river, a few hiking trails that looped around and led to a big valley where elk usually gathered in the early mornings. Most of the visitors were locals, campers, hunters, fishermen. It was quiet work, and that's what I liked about it. Long days spent outside, the smell of pine and wet dirt, the sound of the wind through the trees. That summer had been hot, dry, and the streams were running low. I remember that clearly because most of my days were spent patrolling the back trails, checking the condition of the water sources and looking for any sign of fire or illegal camps. Around mid-July, I started noticing something strange near the northern section of the park, a part that rarely saw visitors because it was rough terrain, thick undergrowth, uneven rock, and no official trails past the ridgeline. There was an old ranger service road that led up there, but it hadn't been used in years. It started with tracks. The kind that didn't make sense. Not animal tracks, not vehicle ones either. I found them early one morning in a dry patch of clay near a creek. Bare footprints. Human. They looked like they'd been there overnight. At first I thought maybe some hikers had wandered off trail, but the distance from the main path was too far. No one would walk barefoot through that kind of rough ground. I made a note of it and moved on, thinking maybe someone was just camping nearby. A few days later, I was checking one of the old cabins we used for emergency storage, just an old wooden structure with a metal roof about 10 miles from the main station. When I opened the door, it looked like someone had been inside recently. Some food tins were missing, a sleeping bag had been unrolled, and one of the windows was broken. I assumed maybe a transient had used it. It wasn't uncommon, though rare that far into the park. I cleaned it up, wrote the report, and didn't think much more about it. But over the next week, I began finding more signs that someone was living out there. Small fires in strange places, half-burnt clothing, and at one point an entire deer carcass hung from a tree branch near one of the creeks, stripped almost completely clean. The way it was done bothered me. The cuts were precise, careful, not the messy work of scavengers or poachers. Whoever was doing it knew what they were doing. I started hiking deeper into that section every morning, leaving before sunrise so I could cover more ground before it got too hot. I didn't tell anyone right away because I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with. It could have been a hunter living illegally off the grid or just someone avoiding people. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. There was one particular morning that I still remember vividly. I'd been hiking along a ridgeline that overlooked the valley when I noticed smoke rising from the trees below. It wasn't a big column, just a thin gray line, like from a small campfire. I marked the direction and started down toward it. The ground was steep and loose, covered with pine needles and rock. It took me nearly an hour to reach the spot where the smoke was coming from. When I got there, the fire was out, but the coals were still warm. There was a crude shelter made from branches and bark, tucked between two fallen trees. Inside were some old cans, a few bones, and something that stopped me cold. A ranger jacket, one of the old designs from years back, with the patch half torn off. It looked like it had been there for a long time, weathered and dirty, but not enough to be decades old. I didn't recognize it as anyone's current gear, so it had to be from a previous ranger. I made a note to ask about it later, though at that moment I just wanted to get out of there. The woods felt wrong, too quiet. I decided to set up a trail camera nearby. I mounted it to a tree facing the shelter, angled low so it would catch anyone coming or going. Then I headed back to my truck before dark. The hike back was long and hot, and I didn't reach the service road until nearly 9 at night. By then, the forest was dark and filled with that heavy silence that comes before a storm. 2 days later, I returned to retrieve the camera. The shelter was gone, completely gone. The branches had been scattered, the ashes from the fire pit buried, and there wasn't a single sign that anyone had ever been there. But the camera was still strapped to the tree. When I checked the footage later that evening, my stomach dropped. The camera had captured movement just after midnight. The figure that walked into the frame wasn't wearing much, just pants, no shirt or shoes. He was thin, almost starved looking, his ribs showing even in the grainy night vision. He walked up to the shelter, stared at the camera for a long moment, then walked right up to it. The last frame before the footage cut out was his face just inches from the lens, eyes wide open, unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing anything. I turned the footage over to my supervisor, and a search was organized the next morning. We spent 3 full days combing that section of forest, rangers, sheriff's deputies, even a few volunteers, but we found nothing. No sign of the man, no more tracks, nothing. It was as if he had disappeared completely. A week later, another ranger named Dave found something while checking the river a few miles downstream. It was a plastic bag caught in some roots along the bank. Inside were a few personal items, old photographs, a folded piece of paper, and a park ID badge belonging to a ranger named Harold Benton. He'd gone missing in 1998. They'd assumed he'd drowned after his truck was found abandoned near the Ridge Road during a storm. That section of the park was shut off after that. Officially, it was due to hazardous terrain and unreliable access routes. Unofficially, none of us wanted to patrol there anymore. I finished out the summer and transferred to another park the following year, even now. Years later, when I think about that footage, I still remember how the man's face looked in the camera light, blank, hollow, and strangely familiar. I later looked up old photos of Ranger Benton. The face wasn't exactly the same, but it was close enough that I stopped looking at it altogether. I've been in this line of work long enough to know that the wilderness can change people. Some go into it and never come out the same. Maybe that man had been living out there for years, surviving off the land, slowly slipping away from reality, until he became part of the forest itself. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. But sometimes, when I'm out on patrol alone and the woods go silent, I can't help but think about that man, barefoot in the dark, staring into a camera he probably didn't even understand anymore. And I wonder how long someone can live out there before they stop being a person altogether. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana during the summer of 2019. The park covered over 200,000 acres of forest, lakes, and high alpine trails. Most days were calm. I'd do patrols, check permits, handle lost hikers, and sometimes deal with bears getting too close to campsites. I loved the job, the quiet, and being away from noise and people. But that summer, something happened that still plays in my mind when I try to sleep. It wasn't anything supernatural or mysterious. It was just a situation that went very wrong. And the thought of how close I came to disappearing out there still makes my stomach twist. It started on a Monday morning in late July. The air was humid, and low clouds hung over the ridgeline like dirty smoke. I'd been assigned to check an old fire road that hadn't been used much since a washout 2 years earlier. A trail maintenance crew had reported fresh ATV tracks leading into that area, even though it was closed to the public. My job was to hike in, follow the road to a place called Lark Creek Basin, and make sure no one was camping illegally or hunting out of season. It was supposed to be a 6-hour round trip, easy enough. The road started near an old ranger cabin that had been half swallowed by willows. The first few miles were simple walking, gravel underfoot, birds calling, the sound of water running somewhere below. But after a while, the road narrowed and turned muddy. There were ruts deep enough to snap an axle, and the air smelled like rotting vegetation. I remember noticing how quiet it got once I entered the basin. No birds, no wind. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own pulse. Around noon, I reached the washout. It was worse than the report said, about 30 feet across, with a shallow stream running through it. On the far side, though, I could see fresh tire marks in the mud. Whoever came in had definitely crossed here recently. The tracks led deeper into the woods, so I followed them. After maybe another mile, the woods started to feel strange. There were old tree stumps everywhere, sawed clean years ago, but no sign of regrowth. The ground was littered with broken beer bottles, shotgun shells, and bits of tarp. Clearly, someone had been using the area for a while. After a few more minutes of walking, I saw smoke through the trees. I slowed down and crouched near a fallen log. There was a small clearing ahead with what looked like an old hunting shack. Tin roof, rotting boards, a half-collapsed porch. Behind it sat 2 ATVs, both covered in mud but still warm when I touched the engines. I could smell gasoline and cooked meat. I remember thinking maybe I'd just wait for whoever was there to come back so I could write a citation and escort them out. But as I was deciding what to do, I noticed something that didn't sit right. The door to the shack was open, and there were stains on the ground in front of it. Dark, heavy stains that soaked into the dirt. I told myself it was probably animal blood, maybe from cleaning game. But when I looked closer, I realized there were drag marks leading from the shack toward the trees. I followed them about 20 feet before they vanished into thick brush. My gut told me to leave, but I had to at least look inside the shack for identification or signs of what was going on. Inside, it smelled terrible, old grease, mold, and something metallic. The light coming through the cracks showed piles of trash, beer cans, and torn sleeping bags. Against one wall was a table covered with knives, rope, and duct tape. There were animal bones scattered on the floor, but they were mixed with things that weren't animal. A hiking boot, a piece of blue nylon that looked like part of a backpack, a small metal watch. I recognized the brand, the same kind we sold at the Ranger Station gift shop. My chest tightened. I stepped back outside and started taking photos for documentation. That's when I heard something behind me. Not a person, just a low mechanical click. It took me a second to realize it was from the woods to my right. I froze listening. Then I saw movement. Two men stepped out from behind a tree line, both wearing camo jackets. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. They looked surprised, but not scared. More like irritated that I was there. I didn't say anything. I just raised my hand slowly, trying to make it clear I was law enforcement, and pointed at the badge on my vest. They didn't move at first. Then the one without the gun started walking toward me. His face was sunburned and covered with stubble, his eyes dull and glassy. He didn't say a word. He just kept walking until he was maybe 20 feet away, then stopped. I could hear the other guy shifting the rifle behind him. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't reach for my sidearm because that would make it worse. But standing there felt like waiting for something to break. The silence stretched for what felt like a full minute. Then, without warning, the unarmed one turned around and said something to the other guy too quiet for me to hear. They both walked past me toward the shack, ignoring me completely. I took that as my chance to leave. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on them until I reached the trees. Then I turned and walked fast, almost running once I was out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the washout again. I used my radio to call dispatch, but the signal was weak. Only half my message went through. I tried again as I climbed up the ridge, finally getting enough reception to report that I'd found an illegal camp with possible evidence of poaching or worse. It took nearly 3 hours for backup to arrive. By the time we hiked back to the shack, it was empty. The ATVs were gone. The tools, trash, and bones were still there, but anything that could have identified the men had been cleaned out. Over the next few days, law enforcement combed the area. They found a few burnt patches of ground deeper in the woods, with melted plastic and fragments of metal, maybe from a tent or cooler. Nothing that proved anything, though. The tire tracks vanished once the trail hit hard rock, and the men were never identified. I finished out the season, but I never went back to Lark Creek. Every time I drove past the turnoff, I'd get a tight feeling in my chest. The part that haunts me most isn't the shack or the blood or even the men. It's how normal they looked. They weren't monsters or ghosts or anything out of a movie. Just two regular guys who clearly had no problem doing something awful out there and walking away from it. The park closed that road for good a few months later after more washouts. It's probably overgrown now, hidden under grass and brush, the shack collapsing into the dirt. But sometimes I think about how close I was that day. If I'd walked in just 10 minutes later, maybe they wouldn't have let me walk back out. Every time I tell myself it was just part of the job. I still can't shake the thought that I looked right into the kind of evil that doesn't need ghosts or legends. Just people with the wrong intentions in a place far enough away that no one can hear you.